Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Can you hear it? Not the sounds of your own world, but the echo of a single, decisive strike. A hammer falling upon a metal that should not exist. It is a sound that carries not the warmth of a familiar craft, but the chill of a profound and dangerous mystery. This is the story we are about to share, a tale lost to time, of a creation that was meant to unite a world, but instead threatened to unravel it. Welcome, everyone. We are about to journey back to the very first time a ring of power was ever forged, and uncover the truth of the failed prototype and the master craftsman who vanished from history without a trace. We would love to know where you are joining us from on this exploration, what corner of the world you're in, and what the hour is there. Let us know in the comments below. It's wonderful to feel connected across time and distance, especially as we step into a story that spans both. Our tale begins in a forge shrouded in silence, a place where ambition burned brighter than any furnace. Here, the master smith Kaelen, a man driven by a vision of peace for his war-torn people, stood before his greatest challenge. His anvil held not common iron or noble gold, but a piece of ore that had fallen from the stars themselves. It was cold to the touch, whispering with a latent energy that defied all known laws of nature. His goal was monumental, to craft a band, a circle of unity that would bind the fractured clans together forever. But from that very first hammer blow, something was wrong. The ring that echoed through the workshop was hollow, a challenge thrown at the unknown rather than a promise of things to come. The metal itself seemed to resist, its coldness seeping into the very air, hinting that the price of such a creation would be far steeper than anyone could imagine. This is more than just a legend about a magical object. It is a story about the cost of ambition, the line between genius and hubris, and the quiet, often forgotten, heroes who stand in the way of catastrophe. It's about the apprentice who dared to doubt her master, the whispers in the flame, and the sacrifices made in the heart of a volcanic mountain. As we unravel the layers of this myth, we will see how a single act of creation can echo through centuries, leaving scars on the world and burdens on the souls of those who survive. So, settle in. What follows is the account of a dream that turned into a nightmare, a prototype that was never meant to be completed, and the enduring vigil of those left to guard the world from the consequences. The journey begins now. So Kaelen and Lyra began their work, facing the star-fallen metal that lay upon the anvil like a sliver of frozen night. Their first and most fundamental task was to heat it, to make it pliable, to convince it to accept the will of the smith. They stoked their greatest furnace, a massive stone construct that typically roared with a heat so intense it could soften the toughest iron in moments. They fed it with the finest coal and worked the bellows until the air in the forge shimmered with waves of blistering warmth. Yet, when they placed the ore into the heart of those flames, something deeply unsettling occurred. Instead of gradually taking on the familiar, welcoming orange glow of heated metal, the ore did the opposite. It seemed to drink the light and the heat from the very fire surrounding it. The flames, which should have been licking hungrily at the metal, appeared to be pulled inward, dimming around the ore as if it were a void. And from the dark, cool stone came a low, persistent hum, a sound that was not the cheerful crackle of a fire, but a dissonant vibration that set their teeth on edge and dropped the temperature in the immediate vicinity. creating an island of unnatural cold within the sweltering forge. This was the first undeniable sign that they were not working with any known substance. They were attempting to command a piece of another reality, one that obeyed different, more dangerous laws. It was at this critical juncture, faced with this impossible resistance, that Kaelin's ambition truly began to overshadow his caution. He recalled fragments of lore from half-remembered texts, scrolls so old they were considered more myth than manual. These texts spoke of a quenching oil, brewed from rare minerals and long-extinct plants, an oil said to be able to fix energies that were otherwise unstable. But these same texts carried explicit warnings, labeling its use as forbidden, a trespass into realms of craft that were best left undisturbed. For Kaelen, however, the potential of the ring, the dream of unity for his people, justified the risk. He announced his intention to use this ancient oil, a decision that immediately created a fracture between him and his apprentice. Lyra, who had learned her craft not just from techniques, but from the feel of the metal and the song of the fire, felt a deep, instinctual dread. To her, the ore's humming was not a technical problem to be solved with a stronger reagent. It was a warning cry. She argued that if the metal itself rejected the fundamental act of heating, then perhaps it was never meant to be forged by human hands. She saw the invocation of a forbidden method not as a solution, but as an escalation, a provocation to whatever power slept within the ore. Kaelen, frustrated by the material's defiance and driven by his towering goal, dismissed her concerns as the superstitions of a junior craftsperson. In that moment, the trust that had always flowed so naturally between master and apprentice grew strained, cooled by the same unnatural chill that emanated from the anvil. The stakes were no longer just about succeeding or failing in a craft. They had invoked a forgotten danger, and the very first crack in their partnership had appeared. With the metal finally cooled and unnaturally smooth to the touch, Kaelen knew the time had come to face the clan elders. He carried the dark, polished disc into the great hall, not as a smith presenting a simple material, but as a visionary unveiling a new possibility for his people. The hall itself was a testament to the divisions he sought to heal, with seating arranged by clan affiliation, the spaces between them echoing generations of suspicion and conflict. He placed the metal on the central stone table, and it lay there, absorbing the torchlight rather than reflecting it, a pool of absolute darkness amidst the warm, flickering glow of the chamber. He began his appeal with passion, his voice resonating with a conviction forged in the solitude of his workshop. He spoke of unity, of a bond that could be as unbreakable as this mysterious substance, a symbol around which every clan could rally. He argued that this was not merely a project of metalworking, but a chance to create a new foundation for their society, something stronger than any treaty written on parchment or sworn on a blade. The reaction from the Council of Elders was immediate and fractured, mirroring the very disunity Kaelen hoped to mend. Elder Torvin, a man whose face was a roadmap of old battles, was the first to speak against the proposal. He saw not potential, but profound blasphemy. To him, the metal's refusal to behave like normal ore was a sign of its unholy origin. We are children of the earth. He thundered, slamming a gnarled fist on the table. Our strength comes from the iron beneath our feet, the stone of our mountains. This thing from the cold emptiness between the stars has no place here. To shape it is to insult the very ground we walk on. It is an arrogance that will bring a curse upon us all. His words found purchase among the more traditionalist elders, who nodded in grim agreement, their fear of the unknown outweighing any promise of progress. Yet, from another quarter of the room, a different perspective emerged. Elder Lyra, whose clan had suffered the most from the recent skirmishes, looked upon the metal with eyes full of a desperate, weary hope. "We have tried iron," she said, her voice quiet but cutting through the heated debate. "We have tried stone, and we have tried blood oaths. All have failed. Our children grow up knowing only the shadow of war. If this gift from the heavens offers a chance, however strange, for a lasting peace, is it not our duty to explore it? Is caution worth the perpetual cost of our strife?" Her plea resonated with those who were tired of the cycle of violence, who were willing to grasp at any thread, no matter how strange, that might lead them out of the darkness. The council was thus split into two opposing camps, one viewing the project as a dangerous sacrilege, the other as a last, best hope for survival. Kalin listened to the arguments rage back and forth, and he felt the fragile window of opportunity closing. He could see that a full consensus was an impossibility. The gap between fear and hope was too wide to be bridged by debate alone, and so, in a moment that would define his legacy, he made a fateful choice. He stood, drawing all eyes to him, and declared that he would proceed with the forging. He would take the risk upon his own shoulders and those of his small, loyal team. He believed the results would vindicate his actions, that a finished ring of unity would silence all doubters. This declaration did not unite the council, it shattered it completely. By acting without their full endorsement, Kaelen transformed a scholarly disagreement into a direct political challenge. He was no longer just a master smith, pursuing a difficult craft. He was a renegade, operating outside the established authority of the elders. The consequences were swift and severe. Elder Torvin and his faction withdrew their support entirely, cutting off access to communal resources and openly condemning Kaelin's ambition. The project was now isolated, operating on the fringes of acceptability. Kaelin's standing, once that of a revered artisan, became precarious. Whispers followed him and his team, labels of reckless and blasphemer traded in the market square. The technical challenge of mastering the alien metal was now compounded by a social one, the pressure of working under the weight of disapproval and the looming threat of outright exile if their endeavor ended in failure. The forge, once a place of pure creation, had become a political battleground, and every hammer strike would now echo with the sound of defiance. Back in the secluded workshop, surrounded by the familiar tools of their trade, a different kind of preparation was underway. Lyra laid out the hammers and tongs, the gravers and polishing stones, but her movements were slow, deliberate, her attention constantly drifting back to the dark disk of metal that sat ominously on the main anvil. The air around it still carried that unnatural chill, a cold pocket in the warmth of the forge. As she ran a cloth over a heavy hammer, her hand paused. She looked up at Kaelen, who was meticulously sketching the first designs for the ring, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Master," she began, her voice quieter than usual, hesitant to break his creative trance. He grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up from his parchment. Lyra took a steadying breath. It is just, when I pass my hand near the metal, I do not simply feel cold. It feels as if it is pulling, a slight, almost imperceptible tug, like a draft under a door, but directed inward. It does not feel inert. It feels hungry. The word hung in the air between them, stark and uncomfortable. Kalin finally stopped his sketching and looked at her, his expression a mixture of impatience and disappointment. Hungry, he repeated, the word sounding absurd and childish in the practical space of the forge. Lyra, you are a smith, not a storyteller. Metal is metal. It conducts heat. It responds to force. It does not possess appetites. What you are describing is a physical property we do not yet understand, not a supernatural craving. This is precisely the kind of superstition the elders would use to shut us down. He turned back to his plans, his dismissal final. We must approach this with reason and skill, not with fanciful fears. The only hunger here is our hunger to succeed, to create something that will change our world for the better. His words were meant to reassure, to ground her in the tangible reality of their craft. But to Lyra, they felt like a door being firmly shut. He was not even considering her observation. He was classifying it as a failure of her own perception, a lapse into primitive thinking. The dismissal cut deeper than any criticism of her hammer work ever had. It made her feel alone, as if the very instincts that had always guided her hands at the anvil were now being treated as a liability. As Kaelen became more absorbed in his designs, his back to her and the metal, Lyra made a silent decision. If her master would not listen to the warning whispered by her senses, she would have to find another source of wisdom, one that might give language to her inarticulate dread. Later that evening, under the guise of fetching more charcoal, she slipped away from the main forge and made her way to the archives, a dusty, seldom visited chamber tucked beneath the great hall. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and dried herbs. Using a flickering candle, she searched through racks of scrolls, her fingers tracing faded labels until she found what she sought, a collection tied with a black cord, titled On Celestial Debris and Meteoric Anomalies. Unrolling the brittle parchment, she began to read accounts from smiths of ages past who had also encountered metal that fell from the sky. Most entries were fragmentary, but one passage, written in a frantic, shaky hand, made her blood run cold. It spoke of a shard of night that was cold to the flame and warm to the soul, warning that such materials could act as conduits, drawing not just heat, but essence from their surroundings. The scroll described a failed attempt to work such a substance, an attempt that ended not with a broken tool, but with the lead smith falling into a wasting sickness, as if his very vitality had been leached away. The account concluded with a single, stark sentence. The void-born metal does not wish to be shaped. It wishes to consume the shaper. Lyra re-rolled the scroll with trembling hands, the words burning in her mind. This was no superstition. It was a historical precedent, a forgotten tragedy waiting to repeat itself. But as she returned to the forge, the weight of this new knowledge did not bring clarity. It brought a terrible burden. She could not share this discovery with Kaelen without confirming his belief that she was succumbing to fear and old wives' tales. To speak of it would only widen the rift between them. So, she sealed the secret within herself, a cold, hard knot of certainty in her gut. The partnership of master and apprentice, once built on open learning and shared discovery, was now fractured by a silence filled with dread. From that moment on, they stood on opposite sides of an invisible line. Kaelen, moving forward with determined ambition, and Lyra, holding back, her every action shadowed by the chilling certainty that they were not creating a symbol of unity, but awakening a slumbering predator. The day for the first shaping arrived, a moment that should have been filled with the focused energy of creation. Kaelen lifted the heavy hammer, its familiar weight a comfort in his hands, while Lyra stood ready at the bellows, her expression a mask of controlled apprehension. The metal, still cool and dark, lay centered on the anvil. With a deep breath, Kaelen brought the hammer down in a clean, powerful arc, a strike that had flattened countless ingots of iron and bronze. But the sound that echoed back was wrong, not a sharp, clear ring of metal yielding to force, but a dull, wet thud, as if he had struck something organic and unyielding. The metal did not flatten. Instead, it shuddered, and then, with a slow, almost liquid motion, it began to warp. The surface rippled, twisting away from the hammer's blow, and a deep, spiral groove began to form along its length, a pattern that was intricate, deliberate, and entirely absent from Kaelin's designs. It was as if the substance had a will, a desire for a shape of its own choosing, and it was actively resisting the smith's intention. A flash of frustration crossed Kaelin's face. This was a direct challenge to his authority, not from an elder or an apprentice, but from the very material he sought to master. He could not, would not, be defeated by a piece of ore. His ambition, now mixed with a stubborn pride, took over. He gestured to Lyra for more heat, and as the flames roared higher, he began to hammer again, this time with increased force and frequency. Each strike was heavier than the last, a relentless, rhythmic assault against the metal's defiance. The workshop filled with the jarring, dissonant sounds of the conflict, the grunt of Kaelin's effort, the whoosh of the bellows, and that awful, deadened thud. Lyra watched, her dread growing with every blow. She saw not a master shaping his material, but a battle of wills, and she feared the metal was far stronger than the man. The spiral pattern only deepened under the assault, becoming more pronounced, as if the metal were tightening like a spring, storing the energy of each impact. Then it happened, on what was perhaps the 20th blow, a blow delivered with all of Kaelin's considerable strength and mounting fury. A sharp, crystalline crack split the air. It was not the sound of the hammer, but of the metal itself fracturing. A fine, hairline fissure appeared across the surface of the spiral, glowing for a split second with a sickly, greenish light. In that exact moment, a silent, invisible pulse of energy erupted from the anvil. It did not make a sound, but its effect was instantaneous and total. Every single flame in the forge, the roaring furnace, the smaller heating fires, even the steady torchlight on the walls, was snuffed out at once, as if a giant, unseen hand had clapped over them. The workshop was plunged into a profound and sudden darkness, a silence so complete it was deafening, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the two smiths. The air, which had been sweltering moments before, was now bitingly cold, and it carried the faint, acrid scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The first attempt to shape the ring had not just failed, It had provoked a response, a warning shot from a power they were only beginning to comprehend. The darkness that followed the failed shaping was absolute, a suffocating blanket that seemed to swallow sound itself. For a long moment, neither Kaelen nor Lyra moved, their world reduced to the chill on their skin and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The task of relighting the forges felt Herculean, a defiance of the unnatural silence that had fallen. They fumbled for flint and tinder, their hands clumsy in the gloom, and the first sparks they struck seemed feeble, almost afraid to catch. When a flame finally sputtered to life on a twist of oil-soaked rag, it did not bring the warm, golden comfort they craved. Instead, as Kaelen carefully transferred this tiny fire to the kindling in the main furnace, a new and deeper unease took root. The flames that began to climb the logs were not the familiar orange and yellow of a healthy forge fire. They burned with a pale, sickly blue hue, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, casting a cold, spectral light that made their faces look wan and corpse-like. But the color was not the most disturbing part. As the blue flames grew stronger, they began to behave in a way that defied all reason. They did not simply flicker and dance with the random currents of air. Instead, they seemed to coil and writhe with a purpose all their own, and the shadows they cast upon the rough stone walls of the workshop were wrong. They were not the passive, shapeless blobs created by a normal fire. These shadows stretched and contorted, forming into long, slender shapes that eerily resembled human hands, fingers that seemed to flex, to grasp at the empty air, as if trying to clutch something just out of reach. Kaelen stared, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a combination of the strange flame color and the uneven wall surface. He tried to dismiss it, to focus on the practical need for heat, but the illusion, if it was one, was too persistent, too unnervingly specific. He turned to Lyra, his voice low and hesitant, almost afraid to give voice to the absurdity. "Lyra, the shadows on the wall, what do you see?" He expected her to look confused, to see nothing but the play of firelight, but her face, illuminated by the cold blue glow, was a mask of pure horror. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the same writhing patterns. "Hands," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I see hands, Master Kaelen. They are reaching." Her confirmation was a far greater blow than any denial could have been. This was not a trick of his overtaxed imagination. It was a shared perception, a reality they were both witnessing. The phenomenon was external, a property of the fire itself, a fire that had been fundamentally altered by its contact with the cracked metal. The forge, their sanctuary of creation, had become a theater for phantoms. This shared vision forced upon them a decision that could no longer be postponed. They stood at a crossroads, more stark and terrifying than any political disagreement with the elders. To continue was to acknowledge they were dealing with forces that actively manipulated their environment, that reached back at them from the very elements. To abandon the project now, however, was to admit a defeat that went beyond mere failure. It would mean leaving the metal, with its hungry crack and its whispering influence, right here in the heart of their community. It would mean conceding to the fear that Elder Torvin had voiced, and potentially leaving a dormant danger for someone else to stumble upon. Kaelen, his pride wounded and his ambition now hardened into a desperate obsession, argued that the problem was still one of energy. The blue flames and their eerie shadows were a sign that their current furnace was insufficient, that the metal required a heat source of a magnitude they had never before attempted. He spoke of legends, of an ancient volcanic fissure deep in the mountains known as the Earth's Heart, a place where the planet's own primordial fire boiled up to the surface. It was a place spoken of in hushed tones, a forge of the gods themselves, untamed and perilous. Lyra listened, her instinct screaming that this was a path of madness. To take this volatile, sentient-seeming metal to a place of raw, chaotic power felt like pouring oil onto a smoldering fire, but she also saw the grim determination in Kaelin's eyes. He would go with or without her. Her choice, then, was not whether to stop the project, but whether to let her master walk into the abyss alone, or to accompany him, to be a voice of caution, a hand that might, at the crucial moment, pull him back from the edge. It was a choice born not of agreement, but of loyalty and a dawning sense of responsibility. With a heavy heart, she nodded her assent. The decision was made. They would journey to the Earth's heart, chasing a greater fire to master a greater darkness, unknowingly carrying their problem directly to the one place where its consequences could become catastrophic. The decision to seek out the Earth's heart was not made lightly, and the small band that assembled at first light was a testament to the fraying of Kaelin's support. It was not the team of a revered master smith, but a handful of individuals bound by loyalty, curiosity, or a simple lack of other options. Besides Kaelen and Lyra, there was Ilian, an elderly but brilliant rune carver, whose hands could etch patterns finer than a spider's web. Brenn, a hulking, quiet man who managed the great bellows with effortless strength. And two young porters, brothers from the lowlands, who were tasked with carrying the heavy forging equipment and supplies. They set out under a sky the color of lead, the mood somber and apprehensive. The path into the high mountains was not a road, but an ancient goat track, a jagged scar across the face of the cliffs that grew narrower and more treacherous with every passing hour. The air grew thin and cold, and the vibrant green of the valleys gave way to the stark, gray rock of the peaks, a landscape that felt ancient and indifferent to their desperate mission. The journey itself became a slow-burning trial that mirrored the internal conflict within the group. The first sign of the journey's strangeness came on the second evening. As they made camp in a shallow cave, Brenn was carefully unpacking the metal, which was swaddled in thick layers of felt and leather. He let out a sharp curse and dropped the bundle, shaking his hand as if stung. The rest of the team gathered around. The leather wrappings were covered in a fine, silvery frost, despite the evening being merely cool, not freezing. When Kaelen cautiously unwrapped it, the metal itself was colder than ice, and the ground beneath it was now dusted with the same strange, sparkling frost. There was no logical explanation. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was the metal's energy leaching the warmth from its surroundings, even through layers of insulation. The porters exchanged nervous glances, and Ilian, the rune carver, muttered an old protective charm under his breath, his eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the height of the cliffs. Kaelen tried to rally them, his voice echoing with a forced confidence against the stone. It is a reaction to the altitude, a concentration of its properties. At the Earth's heart, with that immense heat, this resistance will be overcome. But his words sounded hollow. The team's trust, once firm, was now as fragile as the shale under their feet. They continued, but the easy camaraderie of a shared project was gone, replaced by a watchful silence. Lyra walked often beside Ilian, the two of them speaking in low tones, their conversations punctuated by worried looks toward Kaelen, who marched at the front with a fixed, unwavering determination, his gaze locked on the distant plumes of volcanic steam that marked their destination. He was no longer just leading them, he was pulling them along against a growing tide of doubt. The breaking point came on the third day, as they navigated a particularly dangerous switchback carved into a sheer rock face. The path was littered with loose scree, and the drop to the valley floor was a dizzying 1,000-foot plunge. The younger of the two Porter brothers, a boy named Fen, was carefully picking his way along, the heavy pack on his back making his steps uncertain. Without warning, a section of the path beneath his feet gave way, a cascade of rocks and dirt sliding into the abyss. Fen cried out, scrambling for purchase, but the weight of the pack pulled him off balance. It was Brenn, with surprising speed for his size, who lunged forward and grabbed the boy's arm, hauling him back to safety as a torrent of stone vanished into the mist below. Fen was safe, but his leg was badly gashed and twisted from the struggle, and he was shaking uncontrollably from the shock. The entire team was rattled, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. This was no strange omen or mystical chill. This was a tangible, immediate brush with death. The Porters, now just the one uninjured brother tending to Fen, argued fiercely that they should turn back. The mountain itself rejects this journey, the older Porter shouted, his voice cracking with fear and anger. First the cold metal, now this, it is a warning. We will all be dashed on the rocks if we continue. Ilian nodded in grim agreement, and even Brenn's stolid face was etched with concern as he looked at the pale, pain-racked Fen. All eyes turned to Kaelen. This was the moment of decision. A true leader would have prioritized the safety of his people. He would have acknowledged the accident, tended to the injured, and reconsidered the path forward. But Kaelen was no longer thinking like a leader. He was thinking like a creator possessed. He looked at the injured boy, then at the volcanic steam, still beckoning in the distance, and then at the metal, which seemed to pulse faintly in its wrappings. His face hardened. "We cannot turn back," he declared, his voice devoid of its earlier false warmth, now flat and resolute. "The work is too important. We will make a litter for Fen. We will carry him, but we go on." The silence that followed was more devastating than any argument. In that moment, Kaelin's transformation was complete. He was no longer the visionary smith seeking unity. He was an obsessive, willing to sacrifice the well-being of his followers on the altar of his ambition. The team obeyed because they were in the middle of a mountain with few other choices, but the last vestiges of their voluntary trust evaporated. As they fashioned a litter from branches and cloaks, the looks they gave Kaelen were no longer those of companions, but of prisoners following a jailer. His reputation was sealed. He was not just determined, he was dangerously obsessed, and the stakes of their mission were no longer about crafting a ring, but about surviving their master's fixation. Every step deeper into the mountains now felt like a step into a trap of their own making. After days of arduous travel, the sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and deeply forbidding. The Earth's heart was not a single, neat crater, but a vast, fractured plain of black and rust-red rock. where steam hissed from countless fissures like the labored breath of a sleeping giant. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur, and the very ground felt warm, almost feverish, beneath their feet. In the center of this desolate landscape gaped the main vent, a yawning chasm from which a visible heat haze shimmered, distorting the sky above. It was a place of raw, untamed power, a far cry from the controlled environment of their mountain forge. Here, creation felt inseparable from destruction. Working quickly, their movements hurried by the unsettling environment, the team constructed a makeshift forge. They used heat-resistant stones gathered from the area to build a low, circular wall near the vent's edge, positioning it to capture the blistering updraft. It was a crude, desperate structure, a testament to their dwindling options. They carefully unpacked the metal, and as they placed it within the stone circle, something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. For the first time, the star-fallen ore began to glow, but it was not the welcoming, orange-red glow of metal surrendering to heat. This was a cold, internal luminescence, a sickly, pallid green light that seemed to emanate from deep within the substance itself. It pulsed faintly, like a diseased heart, casting a ghastly hue on the faces of the smiths, making them look like specters at a funeral pyre. The metal was finally responding, but not to the volcanic fire. It was awakening to the chaotic, primal energy of the place, and its answer was a light that promised nothing but unease. Kaelen, however, saw only success. To him, the green glow was a sign of breakthrough, a validation of his dangerous gamble. The metal was at last becoming pliable, ready to accept the form he had dreamed of for so long. Ignoring the fearful whispers of the others, he prepared his tools. The instability of their surroundings was a constant threat. The ground shuddered with minor tremors every few minutes, and the roar of the vent was a deafening reminder of the titanic forces at play. It was in this precarious context that he turned to Lyra. With Brenn needed to manage the massive bellows they had rigged to channel the vent's heat, and Ilian preparing his etching tools at a safer distance, Kaelen assigned Lyra a role of critical importance. "You must be my anchor," he told her, his voice raised over the rumble of the earth. "I need absolute focus for the hammer work. You must watch the ground, the forged stones, the vent. At the first sign of a major shift, you warn me. You are the stabilizer." He said it as if bestowing a great honor, but the responsibility settled on Lyra's shoulders like a lead weight. She was not being asked to assist in creation. She was being tasked with preventing a catastrophe, acting as a fragile human tripwire against the fury of the planet itself. As Kaelen lifted his hammer for the first strike in this unnatural forge, Lyra positioned herself where she could see both him and the treacherous ground. The moment his hammer fell, a new and horrifying synchronicity revealed itself. The blow landed with that now familiar deadened thud, and at the exact same instant, a deep tremor ran through the volcanic plain. It was not a random coincidence. Lyra felt it through the soles of her boots, a distinct, rhythmic vibration that matched the cadence of Kaelin's strikes. It was as if the hammer was not just shaping metal, but drumming a command upon the very bones of the world. With each impact, the ground answered. Small stones skittered down the sides of the vent, and the steam hissed with renewed intensity. A cold dread, colder than the star metal had ever been, gripped Lyra's heart. She wasn't just watching for random instability. She was witnessing a direct causal link. Her master's ambition was now conducting the symphony of the mountain, and every beat of his hammer was pulling them all closer to a crescendo that could shatter the ground beneath their feet. Her role as stabilizer felt like a cruel joke. How could one person stand against a mountain that had begun to dance to the tune of their doomed creation? The ring was nearly complete, its form a dark, shimmering spiral that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. Yet, as Kaelen held it with his tongs, turning it in the hellish glow of the volcanic vent, a profound and chilling realization settled over him. The object was physically whole, a closed circle of impossible metal, but it felt profoundly unfinished, like a sentence without a period or a song without a final note. It was a vessel of immense, chaotic potential, but it had no anchor, no principle to give it purpose beyond its own restless, hungry existence. It was power without direction, a storm contained within a band, and Kaelen knew with a sickening certainty that to leave it in this state was to unleash pure entropy upon the world. His dream of a symbol of unity would become, instead, an engine of discord. He needed something to bind it, to impose a framework of order upon the seething chaos within the star-fallen ore. His mind, feverish with exhaustion and obsession, raced through every text, every scrap of lore he had ever studied, and then he remembered the Moonlight crystals. These were not mere gems, found only in the highest, most secluded mountain peaks, where the light of the full moon was said to condense into solid form over centuries. They were revered as substances of absolute purity and order. They were crystalline representations of harmony, of cyclical certainty, of the gentle, governing laws of the cosmos. In the oldest tales, they were used by master crafters to balance volatile energies, to bring alignment to that which was misaligned. To Kaelen, in his desperate state, it seemed like a revelation sent by the gods themselves. The chaotic, consuming nature of the star metal needed the perfect, stabilizing order of the crystal. He would fuse them, creating an alloy not just of materials, but of fundamental cosmic principles. It was an act of breathtaking ambition, an attempt to play at the level of a deity, binding opposing forces of the universe into a single, wearable object. He announced his plan to the others, his voice crackling with a manic energy. Lyra stared at him, aghast. "Master, no," she pleaded, having to shout over the rumble of the vent. "You speak of binding order to chaos, but they are opposites. You would be forcing them together, like trying to mix fire and water. The crystal is gentle, receptive. That thing is a void. It won't accept order. It will seek to consume it." Ilian, the rune carver, nodded vigorously, his hands trembling as he clutched his tools. But Kaelen was beyond listening. He saw Lyra's caution as a failure of imagination, a lack of courage at the final, critical moment. From a small, lead-lined box within his personal pack, he produced the crystal. It was a shard no larger than his thumbnail, but it glowed with a soft, steady, silvery light that seemed to push back against the oppressive gloom of the vent, a tiny beacon of sanity in the madness. With a reverence that bordered on the ritualistic, he held the shard above the glowing ring, which was now pulsing with its sickly green light, as if in anticipation, or perhaps in warning. He whispered a few words of an ancient binding rite, a plea to the forces of creation to allow this union. Then, with a decisive motion, he pressed the pure, ordered light of the Moonlight crystal directly onto the chaotic, hungry darkness of the ring. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was not a fusion, it was a collision. A sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once ripped through the air, so high-pitched and painful, it felt like needles driving into their ears. The gentle silver light of the crystal flared into a blinding white star for a fraction of a second, a final, defiant scream of pure order as it was violently introduced to absolute discord. Then the crystal exploded. It did not simply break. It vaporized into a cloud of incandescent, silver dust. But the ring's rejection was not passive. A whip crack of raw, ethereal energy, visible as a jagged line of silver and green, lashed out from the point of contact. It moved faster than thought, striking Kaelin's hand where he held the tongs. There was no burn, no cut in the conventional sense. Instead, a complex, lace-like pattern was seared across his knuckles and palm, glowing with the same malevolent green as the ring before fading to an angry, inflamed red. The pain was not of fire, but of something far stranger, a deep, bone-chilling cold that felt like his very life force had been flash-frozen and fractured. He cried out, dropping the tongs and the ring, which clattered onto the stone anvil with a sound that was ominously final. The air filled with the faint, glittering haze of the crystal's remains, a ghost of murdered order, now slowly settling over the scene of the disaster. The ring, now marred by tiny, embedded shards of the crystal that had somehow survived the blast, lay pulsating with a new, irregular rhythm. Kaelen clutched his wounded hand to his chest, his face a mask of shock and agony, staring at the creation that had just bitten its maker. The desperate act of unification had not bound the ring's power. It had only introduced a new element of conflict, a wound upon the object that would now have consequences of its own. The silence that followed the crystal's destruction was heavy and profound, broken only by Kaelin's ragged breathing as he clutched his wounded hand. All eyes were fixed on the ring where it lay upon the anvil, its dark surface now studded with the microscopic, glittering shards of the Moonlight crystal. For a long moment, it seemed inert, a mere piece of flawed jewelry. Then, a new phenomenon began, so subtle at first that Lyra thought it was a trick of the steam and the strange light. The ring began to pulse. It was not a visual flicker, but a low, deep thrum that could be felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up through the stone anvil and into the soles of their feet. The rhythm was unmistakable, unnervingly organic, the slow, steady beat of a resting heart. This was no longer the erratic energy of a chaotic substance. It was the sign of a slumbering consciousness beginning to stir. Then came the bleeding. A thin, silvery mist began to weep from the ring's surface, particularly from the points where the crystal shards were embedded. It was not a smoke, for it did not rise and dissipate. Instead, it pooled around the ring like liquid mercury, defying gravity to creep across the anvil in a slow, deliberate tide. As the mist spread, it began to coalesce, to gather itself into shapes. At first, they were just vague forms, shimmering outlines in the air above the anvil. But as the smiths watched, frozen in a mixture of horror and fascination, the forms sharpened. They saw the fleeting image of a cityscape, but unlike any they had ever seen, with towers that spiraled towards a sky filled with two moons. They saw faces, beautiful and alien, their features etched with an expression of profound sorrow, mouths open as if in a silent scream. They saw vast, calm oceans under a green sun, And then, in a flash, the terrifying vision of those same oceans boiling away into nothingness. These were not random patterns. They were memories. They were echoes of places that had been, of people who had lived, all now lost to some unimaginable cataclysm. The images were hauntingly vivid, but they lasted only for a few heartbeats before dissolving back into the silvery mist, only to be replaced by another fragment of a forgotten history. This revelation struck the team with a force far greater than any physical explosion could have. The project was instantly transformed in their minds. They were no longer merely crafting a powerful object. They were violating a tomb. This ring was not an empty vessel waiting to be filled with their intent. It was an archive, a reliquary containing the last echoes of an entire world, or perhaps many worlds, that had been consumed or destroyed. The star-fallen ore was not just a strange metal. It was a survivor, a fragment of a catastrophe that had trapped the essence of what was lost within its atomic structure. Their hammer blows, their attempts to force it into a new shape, were not acts of creation. They were a desecration. They were pounding on the lid of a coffin, and the ghosts within were now beginning to seep out. Ilian, the rune carver, fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in a posture of pure shame, his hands covering his face as if to block out the sorrowful visions. Brenn took a step back, his usual stoicism replaced by a look of visceral revulsion. Lyra's earlier dread crystallized into a cold, certain horror. Her feeling that the metal was hungry had been terrifyingly incomplete. It wasn't hungry for fuel or for heat. It was hungry for context, for wholeness. It was trying to reassemble itself from the memories it contained, and in its desperate, blind way, it was trying to pull their world into its own shattered history to fill the void. Kaelin's wound, the lace-like pattern on his hand, was not just an injury. It was a brand, a mark of his contact with this concentrated sorrow. As he stared at the weeping ring, the obsessive fire in his eyes finally flickered, replaced by a dawning, awful comprehension. He had believed he was a creator, a unifier, but the sorrowful faces swimming in the silvery mist accused him of a far different role. He was a grave robber, and the consequence of his ambition was no longer just a personal failure or a political dispute. It was a spiritual transgression that made the very air around them feel heavy with the weight of a billion silent screams. The forge at the Earth's heart was no longer a workshop. It had become a seance chamber for a dead universe, and they were the unwilling mediums who had foolishly summoned the ghosts. The task of tending to Kaelin's wound was a grim and silent affair. He sat on a rough-hewn stone, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his injured hand resting in Lyra's lap. The pattern seared into his skin was not fading. If anything, the lacy, inflamed lines seemed to be deepening, as if the energy that had struck him was still actively burning its way inward. As Lyra carefully applied a poultice of cooled volcanic ash and medicinal herbs, her mind was racing, trying to process the horrifying visions of the weeping metal. She needed answers, something, anything that could explain what they were dealing with. Kaelin's personal pack lay nearby, and her eyes kept drifting toward it. He was a scholar as much as a smith, and he never traveled without his collection of scrolls and fragments. While he was distracted, his eyes closed against the pain, she made a decision. With a quiet apology in her heart for the intrusion, she gently opened the pack and began to sift through the rolled parchments. Most were familiar to her: treatises on metallurgy, diagrams of forging techniques. But tucked away at the very bottom, separate from the others and tied with a faded black cord, was a single, brittle fragment. It was not a formal scroll, but a ragged piece of parchment, as if torn violently from a larger book. The script was ancient, the ink a faded brown that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. Her heart hammering in her chest, she unrolled it carefully. The language was archaic, but she could decipher enough. It spoke not of celestial metals, but of a concept that made her blood run cold: the soul forge. The text described it not as a physical place, but as a state of creation, an act of crafting where the maker pours not just skill and fire into the work, but a fragment of their own essence, their spirit, their very soul, to bind an object of immense power. It was a forbidden art, a trespass into the most sacred boundaries of existence. And then came the warning, a sentence that was circled and underlined with such force that the quill had nearly torn through the parchment. Beware the soul forge, for its fire cannot be quenched with water, only with life. The creation born of such a union will demand a price from its makers, a debt written not in gold, but in spirit, and it will collect until the account is empty. Lyra's hands trembled so violently, she nearly dropped the fragment. This was it. This was the missing piece. The ring wasn't just an object with trapped memories. Their very act of forging it, their relentless hammering, their desperate attempts to bind it with moonlight crystal, had unknowingly activated a soul forge. They weren't just shaping metal, they were feeding it with their own will, their ambition, their life force. Kaelin's wound wasn't an injury, it was the first installment of the price. The ring was collecting. The vanished memories it bled were not just echoes, they were a warning of what happened to those who failed to pay in full. The scroll fragment was not a mere historical curiosity. It was a direct prophecy of their current nightmare. She had to show him. He had to see that his noble goal had led them into a spiritual trap from which there might be no escape. She approached him, the fragment held out like a shield. "Master Kaelen," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through his pain-filled haze. "I found this. In your pack, you must read it." He looked at her, then at the parchment, his expression shifting from agony to confusion, and then to a flash of anger. He took it, his good hand scanning the ancient text. For a moment, there was silence. Then a bitter, harsh laugh escaped his lips. "Soul forge," he scoffed, his voice raspy. Old wives' tales, Lyra, superstitious nonsense, scribbled by frightened monks who knew nothing of true craft. This is the desperation I spoke of. You cling to these shadows because you fear the light of what we might achieve. This is not fear, it is fact. Lyra shot back, her own frustration and terror giving her courage. Look at your hand. Look at the metal weeping memories of dead worlds. It is consuming us, Kaelen. It has taken a part of you already, and it will take more. The scroll says it demands a price. Ilian and Brenn saw the visions too. How much of our spirits must it devour before you see this is not creation, but a transaction with a demon, and we are the currency? Her words, filled with a conviction he could no longer dismiss as simple doubt, struck a nerve. The pain, the exhaustion, the mounting evidence of their folly, it all converged on him, but instead of yielding, his pride erected a final, desperate defense. He stood up, swaying slightly, and thrust the scroll fragment back at her. "No, this is cowardice," he roared, his voice echoing across the volcanic plain. "You see a challenge, and you seek an excuse to retreat. You would have us abandon our work, abandon the hope of unity, because of a few scary words on a piece of paper, and a trick of the light. The ring is nearly finished. To stop now is to waste everything Ilian's work, Brenn's strength, my sacrifice. You lack the courage to see a difficult task through to its end." The accusation hung in the sulphurous air, cruel and unjust. In that moment, any lingering hope Lyra had of reasoning with him evaporated. His obsession had become a fortress, and her attempts to warn him were seen only as attacks to be repelled. The conflict was no longer about evidence or interpretation. It was about fundamental nature. He saw her caution as cowardice. She saw his determination as a death wish. There was no middle ground left. As he turned away from her, clutching his wounded hand and muttering about final preparations, Lyra's resolve solidified into something hard and unyielding. He would not be stopped by words. He was racing toward the abyss and determined to pull them all in with him. If she could not save the project, and she could not save Kaelen from himself, then her only remaining duty was to save whoever was left. The scroll fragment was not just a warning, it was a call to action. Her path was clear. She had to find a way to stop the process herself, to break the soul forge before its price was the lives of everyone at the Earth's heart. The confrontation over the scroll fragment left a silence between Kaelen and Lyra that was heavier than the mountain itself. They worked side by side in the days that followed, but it was the coordination of strangers, a mechanical dance devoid of trust. Kaelen, his wounded hand wrapped in a crude bandage, became consumed by a new and even more perilous phase of his plan. The ring, with its eerie heartbeat and weeping memories, was physically complete, but he saw its chaotic nature as a problem of spiritual alignment. It was a wild beast that needed a color, a river that required banks. He announced that before any final polishing could be done, the ring must be inscribed with runes of binding, ancient symbols of power, said to anchor an object's purpose to the will of its creator. It was a practice so delicate and fraught with risk that it was seldom attempted, reserved for the most sacred of relics. To Lyra, it sounded less like a solution and more like trying to leash a hurricane with a piece of string. Kaelen insisted that Ilian, the master rune carver, perform the inscription, but when he approached the old man, he found a spirit broken by fear. Ilian refused, his hands trembling too violently to hold a graver. He pointed a shaky finger at the ring, which lay pulsating softly on its bed of stone. "I will not touch that thing," he whispered, his eyes wide with a superstitious terror. To mark it is to give it a name, and to name a demon is to invite it into your soul. Faced with this refusal, Kaelin's resolve hardened into a grim fatalism. If no one else possessed the courage, he would do it himself. He spent hours in solitary preparation, studying the complex, interlocking patterns of the binding runes, muttering the phonetic pronunciations of words whose meanings had been lost for centuries. He was no rune carver. He was a smith, attempting a scribe's most sacred duty, and his lack of finesse was a danger in itself. The ritual began at dusk, as the volcanic vents glow painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. Kaelen cleared a space on the flat stone anvil, placing the ring at its center. He lit a circle of pungent herbs, their smoke intended to purify the space and focus the mind. Lyra, Brenn, and a terrified Ilian were forced to watch from a distance, spectators to an act that felt less like craftsmanship and more like a summoning. Kalin took up the fine-pointed graver, its tip forged from a special alloy, and began to chant. The words were guttural and alien, each syllable seeming to claw its way out of his throat. They did not echo normally in the cavernous space. Instead, they seemed to be absorbed by the thick air, hanging there, accumulating, as his voice rose and fell in the unnatural rhythm of the incantation. The first tangible signs of the ritual's power manifested. The tools laid out around the anvil, hammers, tongs, chisels, began to tremble. It was a faint vibration at first, easily mistaken for another minor earth tremor. But then, a pair of iron tongs slowly lifted a few inches into the air, hovering as if suspended by invisible threads. A heavy hammer followed, then a bucket of water, its surface perfectly still despite its levitation. The very laws of nature were being suspended within the circle of smoke. The air itself grew thick and heavy, becoming difficult to breathe. It was not the humid thickness of the volcanic steam, but a metaphysical density, as if the space around Kaelen and the ring was filling with an invisible, syrupy substance. Every movement required effort, and a profound silence descended, broken only by the relentless, straining cadence of Kalen's chant. Lyra felt a pressure building behind her eyes, a psychic weight that threatened to crush her concentration. She watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Kaelen brought the graver's point down towards the ring's surface. His hand, still wounded from the crystal's backlash, was shaking with the effort of both the physical act and the spiritual strain. His focus was absolute, his entire being poured into the act of inscribing the first, crucial rune. This was the moment of Lyra's terrible choice. Every instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to knock the graver from his hand, to break the circle and stop this madness before it went any further. The levitating tools, the suffocating air, these were not signs of success. They were warnings of a catastrophic imbalance. They were meddling with forces that were not meant to be channeled through mortal hands. But the scroll fragment's warning echoed in her mind. Interrupting a ritual of such power could cause a backlash of uncontrolled energy, a psychic explosion that could shatter their minds or worse. If she acted, she might save them from the ring's binding, but at the risk of unleashing the very chaos they were trying to contain in a single, devastating burst. If she did nothing, she would be complicit in allowing Kaelen to complete an act that might permanently chain their world to the ring's hungry, sorrowful essence. It was a choice between a potential, immediate catastrophe and a certain, slow-burning doom. Her breath caught in her throat, trapped between a warning and a prayer, as the graver's tip finally made contact with the metal, releasing a shower of sparks that were not gold, but a deep void like black. The moment the final, deeply etched line of the binding rune was completed, a sudden and absolute silence fell. It was not the quiet of an empty space, but an aggressive, swallowing silence, as if the world itself had taken a sharp, indrawn breath and was holding it. For a single, suspended heartbeat, nothing moved. The levitating tools hung frozen in the thick air. Kalen's hand, still gripping the graver, remained perfectly still. Then it began, not with a roar, but with the softest, most insidious of sounds. A low, deep hum, that seemed to originate not from the ring on the anvil, but from the very stone beneath their feet. It was a vibration that traveled up through the soles of their boots, a resonant frequency that made their bones ache and their teeth rattle. The sound was impossibly low, at the very threshold of hearing, more a feeling of profound pressure in the skull than an audible noise. It was the sound of the mountain finding its voice, and it was speaking the ring's name. The hum intensified, and the physical world began to answer. A fine shower of dust and small pebbles rained down from the cavern roof high above, pattering onto the stone floor like the first drops of a stone rain. The ground beneath them shuddered, not with the random, geological groan they had grown accustomed to, but with a sharp, distinct tremor that pulsed in perfect, rhythmic time with the hum. It was a direct, causal relationship, undeniable and terrifying. A crack, thin as a hair, snaked its way across the wall of their makeshift forge, a visible scar from the invisible force they had unleashed. The water in a nearby bucket, which had been still moments before, now rippled with concentric circles, its surface dancing to the ring's unnatural song. This was no longer a strange phenomenon contained within the circle of herbs and smoke. This was an interaction, a conversation between the artifact and the planet. The ring was not merely an object sitting on an anvil. It had become an instrument, and the entire mountain was its sounding board. The realization that struck the small group of smiths was more devastating than any single shockwave could have been. Their project, which had begun as a dream of unity, had morphed first into a technical nightmare, then a political crisis, and then a spiritual violation. But this was something else entirely. This was a physical, geological threat. Ilian, the rune carver, let out a choked sob, pointing a trembling finger first at the ringing anvil, and then at the trembling ceiling. Brenn, the strong and silent bellows worker, actually took a step backward, his face a mask of primal fear, the kind of fear reserved for earthquakes and collapsing cliffs, not for crafted objects. The stakes had just been catastrophically escalated. A personal failure would have meant shame and exile. A political failure could have meant war between the clans. But this resonance threatened to bring the very roof of the world down upon their heads. Their ambition had not just risked their own lives or their social standing. It had accidentally armed a divine-scale weapon, and they were standing at its epicenter. Kaelen stared at the ring, his face a ghastly pale in the volcanic light. The obsessive fire that had fueled him for so long was finally, completely extinguished, doused by the cold water of this terrifying reality. He had believed he was inscribing runes of control, of binding, but he had not bound the ring to his will. He had, instead, plugged it into the world's own fundamental energy. He had given it a lever, and the mountain was the fulcrum. The low, resonant hum was not a sign of the ring's power being contained. It was the sound of that power being amplified, broadcast across a medium of unimaginable scale. His dream of a symbol that would unite the clans now seemed like a pathetic, childish fantasy. He had not forged a ring of unity. He had, in his hubris, created a key that was turning in the lock of the earth itself, and none of them knew what door it might open. The personal quest was over. They were no longer just failed craftsmen. They had become reluctant custodians of a potential cataclysm, and their every subsequent action would need to be measured against the stability of the very ground they stood on. The night that followed the ring's resonant awakening was one of the longest any of them had ever endured. The low, unsettling hum had eventually faded from the air, but it seemed to have settled deep into the stone, a permanent tremor in the world that left everyone's nerves frayed and raw. Sleep was impossible. They huddled in their separate bedrolls around the dimming embers of their campfire, each lost in a private vortex of fear and exhaustion, listening to the mountain's new, irregular heartbeat. It was in the cold, gray light of pre-dawn that the first cry of alarm shattered the uneasy silence. It was Brenn, his voice cracking with a panic they had never heard from the sturdy bellows worker. Ilian is gone. The group scrambled to the old rune carver's sleeping place, a small recess in the rock wall where he had sought a modicum of shelter. His bedroll was there, rumpled and empty. The sight that met them, however, was far more chilling than a mere absent companion. Where Ilian's body should have lain, the blankets were dusted with a fine, silvery powder. It was the same unearthly substance that had wept from the ring, the mist of lost memories, now settled into a perfect, ghostly outline of a man. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away, no indication that he had simply walked off into the treacherous landscape. It was as if he had been lifted straight out of existence, leaving behind only this metallic residue, a shimmering negative space that screamed of his absence. The air above the outline still seemed to waver faintly, like heat haze on a summer road, a lingering disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. Panic did not simply set in, it erupted, immediate and visceral. The porters, already traumatized by the journey and the injury to Finn, began backing away, their eyes wide with superstitious terror, muttering about demons and curses. Brenn stood over the empty bedroll, his massive fists clenched, his face a storm of confusion and anger, turning his gaze from the silvery dust to Kaelen, demanding answers with a silent, accusing stare. Lyra felt a cold certainty solidify in her gut, a dreadful confirmation of all her fears. The ring was not just interacting with the world, it was actively consuming it. Ilian, who had been closest to it during the inscription preparations, who had perhaps even brushed against it with a trembling finger, had been the first payment extracted. The Soul Forge was collecting its debt. All eyes, wide with fear and accusation, turned to Kaelen. He stood frozen at the edge of the group, his face ashen, his bandaged hand hanging limply at his side. The weight of leadership, which he had carried with such defiant pride, now seemed to crush him. The theoretical danger had become terrifyingly real. He was no longer facing a rebellious metal or a disapproving council. He was facing the void where a friend and colleague had been. The two paths before him were equally horrific, a choice between two forms of damnation. One path was to continue, to believe, with a desperate, final shred of hope, that if he could just complete the ring, if he could somehow master the forces he had unleashed, he might be able to use its power to reverse what had happened, to pull Ilian back from wherever he had been taken. It was a gamble of astronomical proportions, a bet that the very thing that had devoured his friend could also be forced to regurgitate him. It was the choice of the obsessed creator, the man who could not admit that his creation was inherently, irredeemably monstrous. The other path was one of brutal, immediate finality. It was the path Lyra silently advocated for with her terrified, knowing eyes. It was to destroy the ring. To take the largest hammer and smash the pulsating band into dust, to melt it in the hottest part of the volcanic vent, to unmake the abomination before it could claim another victim. But this path carried its own unspeakable risk. What if Ilian's existence was now tied to the ring? What if destroying the vessel also annihilated the soul trapped within it? To choose destruction was to potentially murder their friend in an attempt to save themselves. It was to make Ilian's disappearance permanent, to become his executioners. Kaelen was trapped between the sin of continued recklessness and the sin of potentially fatal caution. His terrible choice was not between good and evil, but between a slow, creeping doom that promised a slim chance of redemption and a swift, decisive act that offered safety at the cost of a man's possible salvation. The fate of Ilian, and indeed of all of them, now hung on the decision of a broken man standing over a patch of glittering, accusatory dust. The frantic council gathered not around a fire, but around the ghostly outline of their missing friend, the silvery dust on Ilian's bedroll, serving as a more potent and terrifying agenda than any words could. The cavern itself seemed to be a participant in their debate, the ground offering a low, persistent shudder as a reminder of the resonance they had unleashed. Lyra spoke first, her voice strained but clear, cutting through the tremors and the heavy silence. She did not plead or whisper. The time for subtlety had vanished with Ilian. She argued for immediate and total dissolution of the ring. It is not a tool to be mastered, she stated, her eyes locked on Kaelen. It is a wound in the world, and it is widening with every moment we hesitate. It has taken Ilian as a down payment. It will take more. We must unmake it now, before it learns how to take everything. Her plan was brutal in its simplicity. Use the volcanic vent itself. Heat the ring to a point beyond any tolerance, and shatter it with a hammer of cold iron, attempting to overwhelm its unnatural resilience with the planet's own raw, destructive power. It was a desperate act, but to Lyra, it was the only act that acknowledged the true nature of their enemy, an enemy that consumed reality itself. Kaelen, however, was a man clinging to the splintered wreckage of his dream. The sight of Ilian's empty bedroll had not broken his resolve. It had twisted it into a new, more dangerous shape. Where Lyra saw a predator to be destroyed, he saw a malfunctioning mechanism, a door that had swung shut and now needed to be forced back open. His face was gaunt, shadowed by pain and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a feverish light. Destroy it, he countered, his voice raspy. And what of Ilian? Do we simply carve his name on a memorial and forget him? This power, this connection it has established, it is a two-way street. If it can pull him in, then it can be commanded to push him back out. To destroy the ring is to slam that door forever, to condemn him to whatever void he has been taken to. We must control it. We must complete the binding. The runes were a start. They need refinement, more power, a purer focus. We can bring him back. I know we can. His argument was a seductive poison, offering hope where there was only horror. It was the logic of the gambler who has lost everything and now bets his soul on one last, impossible hand, believing that the very force that ruined him must also be his salvation. The small group fractured along a fault line of fundamental belief. Brenn, the bellows worker, his massive frame seeming to sag under the weight of the decision, sided with Lyra. His was not a choice of complex philosophy, but of visceral instinct. He had felt the mountain tremble. He had seen a good man vanish into shimmering dust. "I trust the feel of stone under my feet," he rumbled, "and the stone tells me this thing is a sickness. I will not feed the sickness. I stand with Lyra." The remaining porter, tending to his injured brother Fen, nodded vehemently, his fear making him a silent but solid ally for Dissolution. They represented the will to survive, to sever the infected limb to save the body. But there was one among them whose fear took a different shape. The injured Fen, pale and shivering from his wound and the pervasive chill, looked from the resolute Lyra to the desperate Kaelen and saw a different path. The idea of destroying the ring, of provoking it further, terrified him more than the status quo. "What if you are wrong?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What if trying to break it makes it retaliate? What if it pulls the whole mountain down on our heads? At least now, it is just humming. Maybe Master Kaelen is right. Maybe there is a way to make it right, to fix this without more violence." His was the voice of paralyzing fear, the hope that the monster in the room might be appeased rather than confronted. It was a vote not for Kaelin's plan, but for an action, which in practice meant allowing Kaelen to continue. This split, this impossible stalemate between destruction, control, and paralysis, created a tension so thick it was harder to breathe than the sulfurous air. They were no longer a team, but a microcosm of a society in collapse, arguing over how to manage an existential threat with no clear solution. Kaelen looked at the divided faces, at Lyra's unwavering determination, and he understood that his authority had evaporated. He could not command the men anymore, but he could still act. In a move that marked the absolute point of no return, he stepped forward, his movements stiff with pain and resolve. "Then the burden is mine alone," he declared, his voice hollow. "The consequence is mine to bear. If you will not help me save Ilian, you will not stand in my way." Before anyone could react, he strode to the anvil where the ring pulsed with its sickly green light. He ignored the biting cold that radiated from it, and with his uninjured hand, he snatched it up. The moment his skin made contact, a visible shudder ran through his body, and his face contorted in a mixture of agony and ecstasy. He did not put it in a pouch or a box. He clenched it tightly in his fist, turning to face them, the ring's glow seeping out between his fingers like captured poison. The act was one of profound and terrifying possession. By taking physical custody of the ring, by making his own body its vessel and shield, Kaelen severed the last ties of collaboration. Lyra, Brenn, the porters, they were no longer his apprentices or his companions. In that moment, they became his wardens or his adversaries. He had drawn a line around himself and the ring, a boundary defined by obsession and a twisted sense of responsibility. The conflict was no longer a debate. It had become a standoff. The question hanging in the trembling air was no longer what to do about the ring, but what they were now willing to do about Kaelen. Alone in the flickering half-light of the volcanic vent, with the others having withdrawn to a fearful distance, Kaelen finally surrendered to the ring's pull. The silvery mist, which before had been an intermittent weeping, now flowed from the embedded crystal shards in a constant, languid stream. It no longer merely pooled around the ring, but rose into the air, coiling and twisting like a living vine made of liquid moonlight, filling the space around the anvil with a soft, ethereal glow. And with this constant flow came the sound. It was no longer just the low, resonant hum that troubled the mountain. Now, layered underneath it, was a chorus of whispers. They were not loud, but they were innumerable, a tapestry of faint voices speaking in languages he could not comprehend, their tones ranging from mournful sighs to desperate, hurried pleas. This was the true voice of the bleeding star, the collective consciousness of the memories trapped within, and Kaelen, in his isolation and growing desperation, made a fateful choice. He would listen. He would try to understand. He leaned closer, ignoring the biting cold that radiated from the metal and the way the mist seemed to cling to his skin with a static charge. He closed his eyes, shutting out the hostile landscape, and focused all his attention on the whispering stream. At first, it was a cacophony, a meaningless rush of sound like the roar of a distant ocean. But as he concentrated, as he allowed his own mind to become still and receptive, individual threads began to separate from the whole. He could not grasp words, but he could grasp emotions. A profound, aching loneliness from one voice, a sudden spike of terror from another, a wistful memory of warmth from a third. He was not hearing with his ears, he was feeling with his soul, and the sheer weight of the sorrow washing over him was immense, an ocean of loss that threatened to drown his own identity. He was seeking a single voice, a trace of Ilian, a sign that his friend was among these echoes and could be retrieved, but the ring did not give up its secrets so easily. Instead of offering answers, it began to ask questions, not with words, but by projecting sensations and images directly into his mind. A sudden, vivid memory, sharp and clear as his own, flashed behind his eyes, the smell of pine needles after a rain, the warmth of the sun on his face as a child, learning his first hammer stroke from his own long-dead master. It was a happy memory, a cornerstone of his identity, and for a moment it filled him with a comforting warmth. But then the memory twisted. The sun dimmed, the kindly face of his master contorted into a mask of accusation, and the familiar hammer in his hand turned icy cold and began to crumble to dust. A wave of despair, so alien and potent it felt like a physical blow, followed the corrupted memory. It was not his despair, it was the ring's, or rather, the despair of one of the countless souls trapped within it, using his own past as a canvas to paint its own misery. This was the psychic maelstrom. It was not a passive recording he was observing. It was an active, hungry intelligence that was learning him, using the architecture of his own mind to communicate its boundless grief. The line between his thoughts and the ring's alien consciousness began to blur, the barrier between self and other dissolving like sugar in water. He tried to pull back, to reassert the boundaries of his own mind, but the connection had been made. The whispers were no longer outside him, they were inside, threading through his thoughts, commenting on his fears, amplifying his doubts. A thought would arise, "I have failed them all," and a dozen whispering voices would echo it, agree with it, expand upon it, feeding his guilt with their own ancient regrets. His obsession with completing the ring, which he had justified as a quest to save Ilian, was now reframed by the whispering chorus as a selfish, arrogant desire for vindication. They showed him fleeting images from their own perspectives, a towering city of crystal being consumed by green fire, a peaceful people looking up in terror at a falling sky. In these visions, he saw figures that resembled Kaelen himself, proud creators, architects of their own doom, who had reached too far and brought about the end of everything they loved. The ring was holding up a mirror, and the reflection it showed was not that of a heroic savior, but of a destroyer. The psychic feedback loop was complete. His own guilt and the ring's inherent narrative of consumption and loss fed each other, creating a vortex of despair from which he could see no escape. The physical cold of the metal was now nothing compared to the spiritual chill seeping into his core. He was no longer a man trying to master a powerful object. He was becoming a temporary vessel for a symphony of the damned, and the music was slowly driving him mad. The answers he sought were there, but they were answers that shattered the very one who questioned, revealing a truth far more terrible than mere failure. The night after Kaelen took possession of the ring was a vigil of shared terror. No one slept. They huddled together, not as a united team, but as survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a stormy sea, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure of Kaelen. He sat apart, cross-legged before the anvil, the ring glowing faintly in his cupped hands. He did not move, but they could see the play of emotions on his face in the volcanic light. A flicker of recognition, a wince of pain, a slackening of despair. He was a world away, lost in a conversation only he could hear, and the silence from his corner was more frightening than any outburst could have been. It fell to Brenn, the most grounded of them, to take the first watch. He positioned himself between the others and Kaelen, his broad back a silent wall of defiance, his eyes scanning the trembling darkness of the cavern. Lyra tried to rest, but every shudder of the earth beneath her bedroll felt like a countdown. She watched Brenn's silhouette, a solid, reassuring shape, against the faint glow of the vent, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a fitful, nightmare-ridden doze. It was a sound that woke her, a sound that had no place in the deep silence of the mountain night. It was not loud, but it was wrong, a brief, high-pitched whine, like a taut wire being sliced, followed instantly by a percussive thump of air, as if a giant door had been slammed shut in a vacuum. Her eyes snapped open. The cavern was plunged into an even deeper darkness for a split second, a sudden absence of the vent's ambient glow, as if the light itself had been sucked out of the world. In that fleeting moment of blackness, she saw it. Where Brenn had been standing, there was now a distortion in the air, a shimmering patch of reality that seemed to wrinkle and fold in on itself, like a reflection in disturbed water. It lasted for less than a heartbeat, and then the light returned to normal, and the sound vanished, leaving only a ringing silence in its wake. Brenn was gone. Lyra scrambled to her feet, a cry catching in her throat. The spot where the sturdy bellows worker had stood was empty. There were no footsteps leading away, no sign of a struggle, no silvery dust like the ghostly residue of Ilian's disappearance. Brenn had simply ceased to exist, erased from the world in a blink of light and a wrenching of sound. The porters, jolted awake by her movement, stared at the empty space, their faces masks of pure, uncomprehending horror. Fen let out a low moan, burying his face in his hands. Lyra's gaze shot to Kaelen. He had not moved. He seemed entirely unaware of the catastrophic event that had just occurred mere yards from him. The ring in his hands pulsed once, a little brighter, and a faint, almost satisfied sigh seemed to whisper through the cavern. In that terrible moment, Lyra understood everything with chilling clarity. Kaelen was not a master trying to control the ring. He was a source, a beacon. His intense focus, his psychic communion with the artifact, was like a signal fire, and the ring was using that connection to draw its sustenance ever closer. It had consumed Ilian, who had been near it. Now it had taken Brenn, who had been near Kaelen. The circle of its hunger was expanding, and they were all standing within its reach. This second disappearance was qualitatively different from the first. Ilian's vanishing had been silent, a theft in the night. Brenn's was a violent, audible event, a demonstration of power. It was no longer a subtle leeching. It was an active, aggressive consumption. The danger was not just escalating, it was accelerating, hurtling toward a point of no return that was much closer than any of them had feared. Looking at Kaelin's entranced form, Lyra knew that any hope of reasoning with him was gone. He was lost, a willing conduit for the very force that was devouring them. To stay was to wait for her own turn to be unmade, or to watch the porters be snatched into nothingness. The responsibility, the awful weight of decision, settled onto her shoulders alone. They could not fight this with hammers or runes. They needed knowledge, a wisdom that understood the nature of this catastrophe. It was then that she remembered the old tales, the stories traded by hunters and wanderers who braved the high peaks. They spoke of a hermit, an ancient woman who lived in the highest, most treacherous reaches of the volcanic range, near the fumaroles where the earth's breath was hottest. She was said to be a sage, a keeper of forgotten lore, someone who understood the whispers of the earth and the secrets of things that fell from the sky. It was a slender thread of hope, a rumor in the face of an undeniable reality, but it was the only thread left. To seek her out meant abandoning the forge, leaving Kaelen alone with the ring, and embarking on a perilous journey through a landscape that was already shaking itself apart. But to do nothing was to accept annihilation. Her decision was made not from courage, but from a complete absence of any other choice. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter into the cavern, painting the scene of their despair in pale, sickly colors, Lyra quietly gathered a small satchel of provisions. She spoke a few hushed, grim words to the terrified porters, instructing them to stay together, to stay away from Kaelen, and to light no fires. Then, without a backward glance at the master who had led them all into this abyss, she slipped out of the cavern and began the arduous climb upward, leaving the trembling earth behind, chasing a ghost of a chance to save what remained of their world. The climb away from the forge felt less like an ascent and more like an escape. Each step upward, a desperate flight from the suffocating dread that had settled in the volcanic chamber below. Lyra pushed her body to its limits, driven by a terror that was colder and sharper than the thin mountain air. She scrambled over jagged ridges of black rock, the path barely visible, her hands scraped and raw. The constant, low-frequency tremor that now lived in the mountain seemed to follow her, a grim reminder that the ring's influence was not confined to the cavern. It was a poison seeping into the very bedrock. She climbed for what felt like an eternity, her mind replaying the horrifying distortion of light and sound that had swallowed Brenn, the emptiness where he had stood a wound in her memory. She was not seeking a miracle. She was chasing the faintest whisper of a rumor, the last possible thread of understanding in a world coming undone. She found the hermit not in a cave or a hut, but in a place of surreal tranquility, a stark contrast to the violent geology surrounding it. Nestled in a high alcove, sheltered from the worst of the winds, was a natural hot spring. Its waters steamed gently in the cold air, pooling in a basin of smooth, white stone. Moss and a few stubborn, fragrant herbs grew around its edges, a tiny oasis of life in the mineral-stained wilderness. And there, sitting serenely on a flat rock at the water's edge, was the ancient woman. She was so still that for a moment Lyra mistook her for a weather-worn statue. Her hair was a wild cloud of silver white, and her skin was a tapestry of wrinkles. But her eyes, when they turned to Lyra, were not the cloudy eyes of age. They were sharp, clear, and held a depth of knowing that made Lyra feel like a child who had just stumbled into a library of forgotten truths. The woman did not seem surprised. She merely gestured to a space on the rock beside her, as if she had been expecting a visitor all along. Lyra's story tumbled out in a ragged, breathless rush: the star-fallen metal, the failed shapings, the whispering flames, the disappearances, Kaelin's possession, the resonant hum that troubled the mountain. The hermit listened in absolute silence, her gaze fixed on the placid surface of the hot spring, as if reading the reflections of Lyra's words in the water. When Lyra finished, emotionally spent and shivering despite the spring's warmth, the ancient woman finally spoke. Her voice was not a dry rasp, but surprisingly melodic, each word chosen with the care of a master craftsperson, fitting a precious stone. "You have not been forging a ring," she said, her tone carrying a profound and weary sadness. "You have been feeding a void. The material you call metal is no such thing. It is a shard of discord, a fragment from a realm that tore itself apart in an age before this one." She explained that such shards were not mere debris. They were psychic residue, crystallized echoes of a catastrophic conflict that had unraveled an entire reality. They were beings of pure, negative potential, driven by an insatiable hunger to become whole again. "A thing that is broken seeks to mend itself," the hermit continued, her eyes now locking with Lyra's, imparting a truth that felt like a physical weight. "But this shard has no memory of what it was. It only knows what it is not. It is not complete. So, it tries to complete itself with what is at hand. It consumes the essence, the spirit, the very history of those who come near it, trying to use their substance to fill its own emptiness. Your master's ambition, his life force, his memories, these are not tools to him. They are the first courses of a meal. The others, your friends, were the next." The hermit's warning that followed raised the stakes from a personal tragedy to a cosmic threat. She described the forging process not as craftsmanship, but as the gradual formation of a circuit. Each hammer blow, each rune carved, each attempt to bind it, is like winding a spring or connecting a wire, she said. Your master, in his obsession, is building a conduit for its power. The moment the ring forms a complete circuit, the moment its consciousness fully awakens and connects to the latent energy of this world, it will not simply consume a few individuals. It will begin to unravel the reality around it, pulling this world into its own shattered state to fuel its impossible desire for wholeness. The tremors you feel are not a side effect. They are the first cracks in the foundation of everything. The ultimate goal was no longer to save Kaelen, or even to reverse the disappearances. The hermit made it devastatingly clear that such hopes were luxuries they could no longer afford. The only path forward was one of absolute negation. It cannot be controlled. It cannot be reasoned with. It can only be unmade, she stated, her voice firm and final. You must shatter the circuit before it is closed, but you cannot do it with force alone. for force is what it consumes. You must strike at the moment of its greatest vulnerability, when it is most focused on feeding, and you must use a power opposite to its own nature, not creation, but pure, focused unbinding. She then provided Lyra not with a weapon, but with a ritual, a sequence of words and actions that were less a spell and more a precise surgical strike against the laws of existence that the shard was violating. The fate of their entire reality now hinged on Lyra's ability to return to the forge and convince the remnants of her shattered team to help her perform a desperate act of cosmic surgery on a patient that was actively trying to eat the surgeons. Armed with the Hermit's terrible wisdom, Lyra's journey back down the mountain was a descent into a world fundamentally changed. The dread that had been a cold knot in her stomach was now a clear, chilling certainty. She was no longer just an apprentice trying to stop a mistake. She was a soldier returning to a battlefield with the only weapon that might work against an enemy that consumed reality itself. As she approached the entrance to the volcanic forge, a strange and unsettling quiet greeted her. The constant low hum that had vibrated through the stone was gone. The ground was still. For a heart-lifting moment, she dared to hope that the worst had passed, that the ring's power had somehow spent itself. But the silence was not one of peace. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a predator that has finished stalking and is now poised to strike. She stepped into the cavern, and the scene that met her eyes was one of surreal and terrifying transformation. Kaelen was there, seated before the anvil, but he was almost unrecognizable. The vibrant, forceful Master Smith was gone, replaced by a gaunt, pale specter. His skin was waxy and translucent, like parchment held up to a light, and the veins beneath stood out in stark, blue tracery. The vitality had been leached from him, leaving behind a husk of a man, yet his hands moved with a strange, ritualistic grace. He was performing the final polishing of the ring, using a soft cloth and a fine abrasive powder made from crushed moonstone. And the ring itself, it was no longer a dark, weeping band of metal. It gleamed with a perfect, mirror-like brilliance, a circle of absolute black that seemed to contain miniature galaxies of cold, silver light deep within its depths. It was hypnotically beautiful, a work of art so flawless it seemed to defy the very notion of its own malevolent origin. This perfect beauty was the most frightening thing she had yet witnessed, a seductive mask hiding an unimaginable horror. Most unnerving of all was the effect this final act of creation was having on the environment. The tremors that had threatened to shake the cavern apart had ceased. The air, once thick with the promise of violence, was now unnervingly calm. It was as if the ring, in its near-complete state, had chosen to still the chaos it had created, not out of benevolence, but as a spider stills its web to better feel the struggles of its prey. The ring was no longer testing its power, it was consolidating it, and Kalin, in his diminished state, was its willing instrument. Lyra understood the Hermit's warning with terrifying clarity. This was the calm before the storm. The circuit was almost closed. Kalen's obsessive focus was providing the final, crucial connection. She approached him slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Kaelen," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the sacred silence he had created around himself. He did not startle. He barely seemed to register her presence, his eyes fixed on the gleaming circle in his hands. "Lyra," he whispered, and his voice was a dry rustle, the sound of leaves skittering across stone. You see the perfection. The tremors have stopped. The mountain is at peace. I was right. It just needed to be finished. It needed to be understood. This is not peace, Lyra countered, her own voice gaining strength as she fought against the ring's hypnotic pull. This is a lure. It is quiet because it is almost full. It is drawing you in, Kaelen. Can you not feel it? It is consuming you with every stroke of that cloth. She took another step closer, her gaze shifting from his ravaged face to the mesmerizing ring. The hermit I found a sage in the mountains. She told me what this is. It is a shard of discord, a piece of a broken world. It does not want to be a symbol of unity. It wants to break our world to match its own. At the mention of the hermit, a flicker of life returned to Kaelin's eyes, but it was a feverish, defensive light. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw not a master, but a desperate, dying man clinging to the last shred of his sanity. The vanished are not lost, Lyra, he insisted, his whisper becoming more intense. They are within. When I hold the ring, when I polish its surface, I can feel them, Ilian's patience, Brenn's strength. They are not gone, they are part of the whole now. I can hear their whispers, faint, like echoes in a vast hall. I believe I can learn to speak back. I can find a way to bring them through. To reverse what happened. His confession was born of a guilt so profound it had curdled into a delusion. The ring was showing him exactly what he needed to see, a chance at redemption, a way to undo his greatest failure. It was using his own love for his friends as the final bait to secure his total submission. Lyra felt a profound sorrow wash over her, colder than the ring's touch had ever been. The confrontation was no longer about evidence or logic. It was a clash of two irreconcilable truths. She stood on the solid ground of the hermit's warning, her certainty of doom, a grim fortress built on the ashes of her hope. He floated in a sea of desperate fantasy, his belief in salvation, the only thing keeping him from drowning in the realization of what he had truly done. His hope was a phantom, a cruel illusion crafted by the ring, but it was the only thing he had left. Her certainty was a brutal, unyielding truth that offered no comfort, only the stark necessity of destruction. They were master and apprentice no longer. They were opposing forces in a battle for the fate of the world, and the point of no return was not the ring's completion, but this very moment, where hope and doom stared at each other across a polished circle of oblivion, with nothing left to say. The confrontation between hope and doom stretched into a tense and silent stalemate, the perfect, chilling beauty of the ring, holding both Lyra and the entranced Kaelen in a fragile balance. But as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the volcanic plain, the ring's passive seduction came to an end. The low, resonant hum that had become the mountain's new heartbeat began to change. It climbed in pitch, shifting from a sub-audible vibration to a thin, piercing whine that felt like a needle driven deep into the ear. This was not the sound of a slumbering power. It was the sound of that power, awakening with a specific and terrifying intent. The change in the air was immediate and visceral. The warmth emanating from the volcanic vent, which had been a constant, oppressive presence, was suddenly pulled away, as if by a giant, unseen siphon. The temperature plummeted, not with the gradual coolness of evening, but in a swift, shocking drop that made the remaining smiths, Lyra and the two terrified porters, gasp as their breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The light began to die next. The deep oranges and reds of the sunset, leaching into the cavern, seemed to dim and wither before their eyes, the colors draining away as if the very photons were being sucked into a void. The ring itself, that perfect circle of black brilliance, became the epicenter of this unnatural twilight. It did not glow brighter. Instead, it seemed to become a hole in reality, a puncture in the world through which light and warmth were actively fleeing. The cavern was plunged into a deep, premature dusk, a gloom so profound and cold it felt less like the absence of day and more like the presence of an ancient, starless night. This was no longer a strange phenomenon or a psychic attack. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of the ring's core nature. The Hermit's words echoed in Lyra's mind with horrifying clarity. It was hungry. It had finished its seduction of Kaelen and was now openly feeding. The porters, Fen and his brother, cried out in pure terror, scrambling backward until their backs hit the cold stone wall of the cavern, their eyes wide with the primal fear of a prey animal, sensing a predator it cannot see. Kaelen, however, remained motionless, his face a mask of ecstatic surrender. He seemed not to feel the cold, viewing the draining of light and heat as a sacred silence, a necessary prelude to the communion he believed was coming. He was not a defender. He was a willing sacrifice laid upon the altar of his own creation. In that moment of escalating horror, Lyra's fear hardened into a desperate, focused resolve. They could not fight this with hammers or strength. They needed to fight energy with energy, but not the raw, chaotic power of the volcano that had only amplified the ring's discord. She remembered the Hermit's instruction about using a power opposite to the ring's own nature. The ring consumed. It was a creature of absorption and negation. What was its opposite? Not a greater force to overwhelm it, but something it could not easily consume, something reflective, something pure and constant that did not generate heat but borrowed it, something of order rather than chaos. Her eyes darted to the mouth of the cavern, where the last sliver of the true sun had vanished, and the first pale hint of the rising moon was beginning to silver the edge of the sky. Moonlight, it was not a fire to be extinguished. It was a reflection, a cool, steady energy of guidance and cycles, the very antithesis of the ring's devouring void. The moonlight, she shouted to the porters, her voice cutting through the oppressive whine. We need to reflect it. Anything shiny, now. Her command broke their paralysis. They frantically scrambled through their packs and the scattered tools, their hands numb with cold. One found a small, polished steel plate used for examining the fine details of metalwork. Another uncovered a discarded, concave shield that had been part of their forging setup. They were poor mirrors, but they were all they had. Positioning themselves at the cavern's entrance, they angled the metal surfaces, their movements clumsy and frantic, trying to catch the feeble light of the just visible moon and cast it toward the pulsating ring. The first beam of reflected moonlight that cut through the unnatural twilight was like a blade of silver. It was faint, almost laughably so against the overwhelming darkness emanating from the ring. But the effect was instantaneous and profound. The moment the cool, silvery light touched the ring's surface, the high-pitched whine faltered, stuttering like a scratched record. The ring's pull on the surrounding energy seemed to hesitate, as if it had encountered a taste it could not process. The light was not fuel, it was a mirror, and the ring's own consuming nature recoiled from it. The temperature in the cavern stabilized, no longer plummeting but holding at a biting, yet manageable, cold. The darkness ceased its advance, held at bay by these thin, wavering beams of borrowed light. It was not a victory, it was a temporary barrier, a desperate holding action. Lyra and the porters had to constantly adjust their reflections, their arms aching with the strain, as the ring seemed to subtly shift its position, trying to evade the irritating purity of the moonlight. They had discovered a vulnerability, but it was a fragile one, a defense that required constant, exhausting vigilance against a hunger that knew no fatigue. They were not fighting to win, they were fighting for time, each passing moment a precious commodity in the face of an enemy that sought to devour the very night they were using as their shield. The thin, wavering beams of moonlight were all that stood between the smiths and the void. Lyra and the porters strained, their arms trembling as they fought to keep the reflective surfaces angled, to keep that slender thread of celestial order focused on the ring. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. The ring's high-pitched whine, momentarily disrupted by the light, began to intensify once more, adapting, pushing back against the irritation. The cold deepened again, and the darkness seemed to press in with a physical weight, threatening to smother their tiny, defiant lights. Kaelen remained at the center of the storm, a statue of devotion to the thing that was killing him. But as the ring's hunger grew more aggressive, its focus shifting from passive consumption to an active, predatory search for more sustenance, something within him finally shattered. A particularly strong pulse of energy erupted from the ring, a wave of force that was not light or sound, but a sheer negation of warmth. The porter holding the steel plate cried out as the metal became so cold it seared his skin, and he dropped it with a clatter that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The defensive line was broken. In that moment, as the last reflected light flickered and died, Kaelin's eyes met Lyra's. He saw not the defiant apprentice, but the exhausted, terrified young woman who had followed him on this doomed quest out of loyalty. He saw the porters huddled together, their faces etched with a primal fear he had put there, and he saw himself, reflected in the perfect black surface of the ring, a gaunt, hollowed-out ghost, a man who had traded his friends, his craft, and his very soul for a beautiful lie. The dam of his obsession broke. The whispering promises of communion, of saving the vanished, were revealed for what they were: a predatory lure, a spider's web of illusions designed to keep him compliant until he was utterly consumed. Lyra had been right from the very beginning. This was not creation, it was a violation, and he had been its chief architect. The clarity that flooded him was not warm, it was as cold and sharp as the mountain air, a final, devastating understanding of the truth. There was no saving Ilian or Brenn. There was no mastering the ring. There was only stopping it. And in that terrible, crystalline moment of realization, he saw the only path left. The ring's attention, now freed from the annoyance of the moonlight, was turning outward, toward Lyra and the porters, sensing the vibrant life force that remained. It was preparing to feed again. Kaelin's sacrifice was not a grand, shouted declaration. It was a silent, internal decision, an act of will more profound than any hammer stroke he had ever delivered. He would not let it take them. If the ring was hungry, he would give it a feast it could not refuse. He would offer it the one thing it had been savoring all along, the entirety of his own life force, his spirit, his memories, his burning ambition, all concentrated into a single, explosive offering. He closed his eyes, not in meditation, but in a final, focused effort of will. He stopped resisting the ring's pull. Instead, he opened himself to it completely, like a river diverting itself into a dry channel. He consciously poured every ounce of his being, his guilt, his love for his friends, his regret, his entire identity, down the psychic connection that bound him to the metal. It was the ultimate act of the smith, using himself as the final, crucial alloy. But this was not an alloy of strengthening, it was an alloy of overload. He was not trying to bind the ring, he was trying to break its circuit by flooding it with more power than its nascent consciousness could contain. The effect on the ring was immediate and dramatic. The piercing whine shot up in pitch, becoming a screech of agonized pleasure. The perfect, black surface of the band writhed, the galaxy within swirling into a frantic vortex. The light in the cavern dimmed further as the ring's consumption focused entirely on Kaelen, drawing the very essence from his body. He did not cry out. He stood firm, his body rigid, a conduit for his own annihilation. The predatory attention that had been reaching for Lyra and the others snapped back to him, fully engaged by this sudden, overwhelming offering. Color drained from his face completely, leaving him a pale, stark monument in the gloom. His atonement was not in words, but in action, a final, decisive act of self-erasure to create a diversion, to draw the monster's fangs away from those he had left to protect. He was buying them time, not with reflected moonlight, but with the last flicker of his own soul. The cavern became a silent, frozen tableau of sacrifice. Kaelen stood as a conduit, his life force flowing into the ring in a torrential, final offering. The ring, in turn, glowed with a ravenous, ecstatic light, its attention completely consumed by the feast he presented. It was in this fragile, horrifying moment of distraction that Lyra moved. The Hermit's words were etched into her mind, a precise and terrifying script for an act of cosmic surgery. There was no time for grief, no space for hesitation. Kaelen had given them a window, and it was closing with every heartbeat he had left. She gestured sharply to the two porters, their faces pale with terror. The cold iron hammer, the words now, her voice, though a whisper, cut through the oppressive silence with the force of a command. They scrambled to obey, their movements clumsy with fear and cold. From a leather wrap, one of them produced a hammer they had brought not for forging, but for its symbolic weight. It was made of cold iron, a metal traditionally believed to be anathema to unnatural forces, unadorned and purely functional. The other porter, his hands shaking, held up a small, smooth stone on which Lyra had hastily scratched the words of unbinding given to her by the Hermit. The ritual was not one of great power, but of perfect opposition. It was not about overwhelming the ring with a greater force. It was about introducing a precise, targeted contradiction to its very existence. The Hermit had called it the sigh of negation, a whispered command for something that was to simply cease being. Lyra positioned herself before the anvil, the cold iron hammer feeling alien and heavy in her hand, so different from the balanced forging hammers she was accustomed to. She took a deep breath, the air like shards of ice in her lungs, and began to chant the words. They were not shouted, but spoken with a flat, absolute finality. They were not a plea to any god or a summoning of energy. They were a statement of fact, a declaration that this violation of natural law would now end. As the unfamiliar syllables left her lips, they seemed to sap the warmth from the air around her, creating a pocket of even deeper cold, a cold of absence, of void, the polar opposite of the ring's consuming heatlessness. At the same time, the ring, still fixated on draining the last dregs of Kaelin's spirit, seemed to sense the new, contradictory presence. Its perfect, black surface rippled, as if annoyed by a gnat. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. Its consciousness was fully engaged in the act of consumption, its defenses down. Lyra saw her chance. She raised the cold iron hammer high. This was not a shaping blow, full of the artistry and intention of a smith. It was a strike of pure negation, a hammer fall meant not to create form, but to unmake it. With all the strength of her despair and her resolve, she brought the hammer down directly onto the pulsating band. The impact did not produce a sound so much as it unleashed a phenomenon. A scream tore through the cavern, a sound that was not audible vibration, but a psychic shriek that seemed to originate in the minds of everyone present and radiate outward, shaking the very atoms of the stone around them. It was the scream of two opposing primordial forces meeting in absolute conflict. On one side was the ring's essence, a force of chaotic creation, a desperate, blind hunger to assemble itself from the pieces of other worlds, to build a new whole through an act of infinite consumption. It was creation born of destruction, a perverse genesis. Arrayed against it was the power Lyra had invoked with the ritual, the force of pure, focused negation. This was not destruction in the sense of breaking something apart. It was the concept of unbinding, of unraveling the fundamental threads that held a thing together. It was the power of a word erased from a page, of a memory forgotten forever, of a law of physics momentarily suspended. The cold iron hammer was merely the physical focal point for this metaphysical confrontation. The violent release of energy was not an explosion of light and heat, but a silent, searing wave of white force that bleached the color from the world. It was a conflict without collision, a battle where the very idea of the ring was being challenged by the even more fundamental idea of its own non-existence. The cavern walls did not crack, they seemed to flicker, as if reality itself was stuttering under the strain of this impossible contradiction. The world vanished in a single, silent detonation of pure white. It was not a light that illuminated, it was a light that erased, flooding the cavern with an intensity that had no source and cast no shadow. For a fraction of a second, sight, sound, and feeling were all scoured away, replaced by an overwhelming, featureless blankness. It was as if the universe had taken a sudden, sharp intake of breath and was holding it, suspending everything in a state of absolute potential. Then, as swiftly as it had arrived, the whiteness collapsed in on itself, leaving behind not the return of the previous chaos, but something far more profound and unsettling, a silence so complete it was deafening. This was not the quiet of a peaceful night or a still forest. This was a silence of a different order altogether, an aggressive, absolute absence of sound that felt heavier than any noise. The relentless, high-pitched whine of the ring was gone. The low, troubling hum that had vibrated up from the bedrock ceased. The howl of the wind through the volcanic fissures, a constant companion for days, was snuffed out. Even the subtle, internal sounds of their own bodies, the rush of blood in their ears, the catch of their breath, seemed to have been muted. The tremors that had shaken the mountain to its core simply stopped, the ground beneath them becoming as solid and motionless as if it were the foundation of the world. The whispering chorus of lost voices, that haunting tapestry of sorrow that had filled the air around the ring, was cut off mid-sentence, leaving an emptiness that echoed louder than any sound could. In that impossible moment, every process, every vibration, every iota of energy that constituted their reality seemed to freeze in place. This profound stillness was the true climax of their entire ordeal, the point of resolution toward which every hammer blow, every desperate choice, and every sacrifice had been building. It was not the sound of a battle ending, but the sound of a fundamental law being reasserted. The ritual of unbinding, fueled by Kaelin's ultimate sacrifice and Lyra's unwavering resolve, had not merely broken the ring, it had performed a precise, metaphysical surgery. The forming consciousness of the artifact, that hungry, nascent self that was learning to consume the world, was not shattered by force. Instead, it was cleanly and utterly severed from the reality it sought to dominate. The connection was cut, the circuit opened. The silence was the sound of that severance, the audible signature of a parasitic bond being dissolved. It was the quiet after a fever breaks, the stillness following a storm that has exhausted its rage, a universal pause acknowledging that a terrible wrong had been set right. In that void of all sensation, the only thing that remained was the collective, held breath of the survivors, waiting to see if the world would dare to begin again. The blinding whiteness did not so much fade as it was absorbed back into the world, leaving behind a gloom that felt heavier and more real than the unnatural darkness that had preceded it. Lyra's ears rang with the absence of the terrible silence, the ordinary sounds of the volcanic vent and the mountain wind rushing in to fill the void, a chorus that now seemed deafening in its normality. Her eyes, straining against the sudden dimness, fixed on the anvil. It was empty. Both Kaelen and the ring were simply gone. There was no grand explosion, no dissipating cloud of smoke, not even a trace of the silvery dust that had marked the other disappearances. In their place, centered perfectly on the scarred surface of the great stone anvil, was a shallow, bowl-shaped depression. Its surface was not rough or fractured, but impossibly smooth, fused into a glassy, obsidian-like sheen that reflected the feeble light of the cavern in distorted, funhouse mirrors. It was a crater, a void etched into solid rock, the only physical evidence that anything of consequence had ever happened there. The sheer neatness of it was somehow the most horrifying part, a sterile, geometric scar where a man's life and a world's potential catastrophe had been erased. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved or spoke. The two porters, Fen and his brother, stood frozen where they had been during the ritual, their faces slack with a shock so profound it had not yet allowed for fear or grief. They stared at the glassy crater as if waiting for it to explain itself, for the world to make sense again. Lyra's own body felt like a foreign object, heavy and numb. The cold iron hammer was still clutched in her hand, its weight the only thing that felt solid in a universe that had just been turned inside out. Her gaze swept from the anvil to the spot where Kaelen had stood, her mind desperately trying to superimpose his image over the emptiness. But there was nothing. He was not just dead, he was unmade, his very essence used as the final, critical component in a ritual of negation. The victory, if it could be called that, was absolute and hollow. They had saved their world, but the cost was a void that would never be filled. Then, the emotional toll began to crash down, not as a single wave, but as a slow, chilling tide. It was the knowledge, settling deep into their bones, of what they had unleashed and what had been required to contain it. They had not just witnessed a tragedy, they had been active participants in a chain of events born from the best of intentions, the desire for peace, twisted into the worst of outcomes. Lyra thought of Ilian's gentle hands, now gone to dust. She thought of Brenn's steadfast strength, erased in a flicker of distorted light, and she thought of Kaelen, not the obsessed monster he had become, but the master smith who had taught her everything, whose ambition had once been a beacon of hope for an entire people. That hope had curdled into a poison that had consumed him utterly. The weight of this knowledge was a burden more crushing than any physical load. It was the understanding that creation carried within it the seed of unimaginable destruction, and that the line between visionary and fool was terrifyingly thin. The silence among the survivors was not one of relief, but of a shared, unspoken trauma. They did not embrace or celebrate. They simply looked at one another, their eyes meeting across the cavern, and in that shared glance was a covenant of sorrow. They were bound together now not by a common goal, but by a common nightmare, a secret too terrible to ever speak aloud. The journey back to their homes, to the clans they had sought to unite, stretched before them not as a return to safety, but as a march into a future forever shadowed by the ghosts of the earth's heart. The physical cost was clear in the empty spaces where their friends had stood, but the deeper, more enduring cost was etched into their very souls, a knowledge that would shape every thought, every dream, and every future act of creation for the rest of their lives. They had looked into the heart of a darkness born from light, and the reflection they saw there would haunt them forever. The task of packing their camp was performed with a quiet, mechanical efficiency, each movement feeling hollow and rehearsed. There was no discussion, no division of labor. They simply moved, gathering tools that now seemed like artifacts from another lifetime. The mighty bellows Brenn had worked stood silent and accusing. Ilian's delicate etching tools were carefully wrapped and stored, a tiny, weightless bundle that felt heavier than any anvil. The volcanic vent, which had roared with the planet's primordial fire just days before, was now eerily quiet, its steam reduced to a few faint, dying wisps. The land itself seemed exhausted, scarred not just by their physical presence, but by the metaphysical battle that had raged there. The ground was no longer warm, but held a deep, penetrating chill that seeped into their bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the mountain air. As they dismantled the makeshift forge, they avoided looking directly at the anvil, at that smooth, glassy crater that was the only headstone for their master and their failure. To pack up was to admit that it was over, that there was nothing left to do but carry the silence away with them. The journey home was a mirror image of their arrival, but inverted in every possible way. Where the path inward had been filled with tense argument and fearful speculation, the path outward was marked by a silence so profound it was its own language. They did not speak of what had happened. Words were too small, too clumsy to contain the enormity of the loss. Each footstep on the treacherous mountain path was a drumbeat measuring their retreat. Each labored breath a reminder of the thin, precious air that Kaelen, Ilian, and Brenn would never breathe again. The voids were everywhere. Lyra would instinctively glance back to check on the porters and see only 2 where there should have been 5. The absence of Brenn's strong, silent presence at the front of the line was a physical force, making the path seem more dangerous. The lack of Ilian's knowledgeable murmurs about the rock formations they passed left the world feeling less explained, more mysterious and threatening. And leading them was not the determined, visionary figure of Kaelen, but Lyra herself, her shoulders bowed under a weight of leadership she had never asked for and did not want. The landscape, which had once felt actively hostile, now seemed merely indifferent, which was in its own way more devastating. The mountains did not care about their tragedy. The wind did not whisper condolences. The sun rose and set on a world that had narrowly escaped, and unraveling it would never know happened. This indifference was a lesson in scale, a crushing realization of how small their personal drama was against the vast, uncaring backdrop of the world. The grand dream of uniting the clans felt like a childish fantasy now, a concern from a simpler time that had been incinerated in the forge of their ambition. The only unity they had achieved was the shared, unspoken trauma that bound the 3 survivors together, a chain forged from grief and a terrible secret. They were not returning as heroes or even as failures. They were returning as refugees from a war they had started against an enemy no one else could see, and the victory had cost them everything that mattered. Each step away from the Earth's heart was not a step toward home, but a step into a future forever defined by the emptiness they carried within them. The journey down from the mountains felt like a descent into a different life, one Lyra had never asked for and was utterly unprepared to lead. Every familiar landmark they passed, a distinctive twisted pine, a waterfall they had drunk from on the way up, was a painful echo of the optimism that had accompanied their ascent. Now that hope was ash, and the small party that trailed behind her was a ghost of the group that had set out. Fen, still limping from his injured leg, and his brother, whose face was permanently fixed in an expression of stunned silence, followed her not out of respect for a master, but out of the sheer, animal instinct to follow the only person left who seemed to have any direction. She was the de facto leader by the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. Everyone else was gone. The physical burden of the Hermit's scroll, tucked securely inside her tunic, was nothing compared to the crushing weight of Kalen's final act. His sacrifice had not been a glorious, heroic charge, but a quiet, desperate offering, a redemption paid for with his entire being. That memory was a brand on her soul, a burden of witness that she alone now carried. As the smoke from the clan settlements finally curled into view in the valley below, the question of what to say solidified from a vague dread into an immediate, terrifying decision. They stopped at a ridge overlooking their home, and the 2 porters looked to her, their eyes full of a desperate need for a story, for an explanation that would make the emptiness behind them somehow bearable. Lyra looked at their young, traumatized faces, and then down at the bustling, ordinary life of the clans, the smiths hammering at ordinary iron, the children chasing dogs, the elders debating in the sun. To tell them the full, horrifying truth would be like bringing the chilling silence of the Earth's heart down into the valley. It would be a poison in their well. The knowledge of the shard of discord, of a power that could unravel reality itself, was not a truth that would set them free. It was a curse. It would breed paranoia, ignite witch hunts, and perhaps, most terrifyingly, it might tempt another ambitious soul to seek out the remaining ore, to believe they could succeed where Kaelen had failed. The Hermit's warning was clear. The knowledge itself was dangerous. And so, standing on that ridge with the wind pulling at her hair, Lyra made her choice. She turned to Fen and his brother, her voice low and firm, stripped of all emotion. "We will tell them there was an accident," she said, "a rock slide deep in the mountains." It was swift. They felt nothing. We were lucky to escape with our lives. The lie was simple, clean, and tragic, in a way that everyone could understand. It was a story of the mountain's indifference, not of a man's hubris or an object's malevolent hunger. It was an ending, not a beginning. She saw the understanding dawn in the porter's eyes, a mixture of relief and a new, different kind of fear, the fear of complicity. They nodded, their silence an agreement to the pact. They would bury the truth alongside their friends, in the deep, cold stone of the peaks. This decision, made to protect the clans from a terror they could not fight, instantly erected an invisible wall between Lyra and the rest of the world. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a keeper, a solitary guardian of a secret that would now live and breathe only within her, a terrible knowledge that isolated her as completely as if she had remained alone in the cavern. The burden of leadership was not about guiding them home. It was about deciding what version of home they were allowed to return to. The return to the clan settlements was not a homecoming. It was an arrival of ghosts. The story Lyra and the two porters told was a simple, tragic shield against a truth too terrible to speak. A rock slide, they said, deep in the mountains. Swift, merciful, the clans, already wary of Kaelin's ambition, accepted this explanation with a grim, sorrowful nod. They mourned their lost master Smith and his companions, their deaths serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the high peaks, a warning that needed no embellishment. Funerary rites were held with empty coffins, and for a time, the community drew together in shared grief. But for the three survivors, this public mourning was a hollow pantomime. They moved through the ceremonies surrounded by the genuine sorrow of their people, yet they were separated by an invisible, chilling wall, the wall of the secret they carried. They had looked into an abyss that no one else could see, and the reflection had forever changed them. In the weeks that followed, the unspoken tension among them became unbearable. They were bound by a shared experience that was also a shared crime, a knowledge that festered in silence. The forge, once the heart of the community, felt like a tomb. The ringing of other smiths' hammers was no longer a cheerful sound of creation, but a trigger for flashbacks to that deadened thud against the star metal. The heat of the fires reminded them of the unnatural cold that had emanated from the ring. They could not look at each other without seeing the ghostly outline on Ilian's bedroll or the distorted air where Brenn had stood. The craft that had defined their lives, that had been a source of pride and purpose, was now inextricably linked to horror and loss. Their genius as a collective, Kaelin's vision, Ilian's precision, Brenn's strength, Lyra's intuition, had been the very thing that led them to the edge of catastrophe. That collective light now felt like a curse. It was Fen, the injured porter, who finally broke the silence that had settled over them. His leg had healed, but a deeper limp remained in his spirit. He found Lyra one evening as she stared into the dying embers of a hearth, seeing not fire, but the cold blue flames of the earth's heart. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Every sound, every smell, it brings it all back. I see it in my dreams. If we stay here, surrounded by the memory of what we were, we will either go mad or the truth will eventually spill out." His brother nodded in agreement, his face etched with the same weary dread. They were not suggesting a betrayal, but a survival strategy. The secret was too heavy to carry in a place that constantly reminded them of its weight. And so, under the cover of a moonless night, the three of them met one last time at the edge of the settlement. There were no grand speeches or tears. The bond they shared was not one of friendship, but of trauma, a terrible understanding that made words unnecessary. They swore an oath, not on any god or symbol, but on the memory of the vanished. It was a simple, brutal promise. They would never speak of the star metal, the ring, or the events at the Earth's heart to anyone, ever again. They would bury the knowledge as deeply as the crater glassed into the anvil. Then, without a backward glance, they parted ways. Ven and his brother turned south, hoping to lose themselves in the bustling anonymity of the coastal cities, seeking lives far removed from mountains and forges. Lyra watched them disappear into the darkness before turning north toward the highest, most isolated peaks. This dissolution was not a failure of will, but a final, necessary act of containment. By scattering, they ensured that the secret of the prototype ring could never be accidentally reassembled. No whispered conversation in a tavern, no drunken confession, no curious apprentice could ever piece together the full story from their fragmented accounts. The truth was safely locked away in 3 separate, broken vessels, cast to the winds, but this act of preservation came at a profound cost. In extinguishing the threat, they also extinguished the brilliant, collective light of their genius. The unique synergy of their skills, the potential for future wonders they might have created together, was shattered forever. The clans lost not just a master smith, but an entire school of thought, a lineage of craftsmanship that had been on the verge of a new understanding. The world was made safer by their silence, but it was also made poorer, its store of knowledge and artistry diminished by a tragedy it would never know happened. The few who survived did not go on to teach or inspire. They simply vanished into the world, carrying their silence like a shroud. Time, as it always does, began to work its slow and patient magic on the raw, bleeding wound of the tragedy. The immediate shock of the loss faded from the forefront of the clan's collective mind, replaced by the daily rhythms of survival, the planting of crops, the forging of plowshares, the simple, grounding needs of life. But a story of such magnitude does not simply vanish. It retreats from the center of the village, square to the edges of the campfire's light, from formal announcements to hushed conversations. The precise, horrifying truth that Lyra and the porters had locked away was too sharp, too dangerous to be handled directly. So, the human spirit, in its need to make sense of the incomprehensible, began to soften the edges, to sand down the jagged details into a smoother, more manageable shape. Whispers about the lost expedition began to circulate, but they were no longer about a specific rock slide. They became tales. In the beginning, the stories were simple, rooted in the known world. Parents would tell their children of the great smith Kaelen, whose skill was so profound that he dared to seek a metal born from a falling star, a material meant to bring an end to all conflict. But the story would go, the heavens, jealous of such ambition, sent a great avalanche to swallow him and his loyal team, a lesson against reaching too high. It was a clean moral, a straightforward parable about respecting the natural order. But as the years turned into a decade, and then another, the stories evolved, fed by imagination and a deep-seated need for a warning that carried more weight than a simple accident. The avalanche was not enough. The tale began to absorb elements from other, older myths. Kaelen was no longer just ambitious. He became prideful, arrogant. The star metal was not just rare, it was cursed, a piece of a broken god or a demon's heart. The failed creation was no longer a mere ring. It was an object of such terrible power that the earth itself revolted against its making, opening up to swallow the entire forge. The truth, with its cold, psychic resonances and its consuming voids, was too alien to survive. It was gradually replaced by a more familiar narrative, that of a hero brought low by his own flaw, a classic tragedy that every generation could understand. Lyra, living in her self-imposed seclusion high in the foothills, far from the clan's main settlement, became an accidental auditor of this transformation. She would occasionally trade herbs or simple tools at a distant market, and there she would hear the stories. At first, the distortions pained her. To hear Kalin, a man broken by guilt and redeemed by sacrifice, described as a vainglorious fool who challenged the gods, felt like a second death, a betrayal of his memory. She would hear descriptions of the ring that bore no resemblance to the silently weeping, memory-bleeding band she had fought to unmake. In these tales, it was a thing of fiery malevolence, shooting lightning and demanding blood sacrifices, a cartoonish villain compared to the subtle, existential horror she had witnessed. The disappearances of Ilian and Brenn became dramatic, theatrical events, swallowed by chasms that opened in the earth, or struck down by divine lightning, erasing the far more terrifying truth of their silent, almost clinical unmaking. But as the years wore on, her pain gave way to a weary, profound understanding. She realized that the people were not trying to be inaccurate, they were trying to be safe. The real story was a poison. It spoke of a universe where creation could turn predatory, where a well-intentioned dream could become a key to unraveling reality itself. That was a terror too vast to live with. The legend, for all its simplifications and exaggerations, served a vital purpose. It packaged that bottomless fear into a container that could be passed down through generations. The moral was clear and sturdy. Do not seek power that is not meant for mortal hands. Hubris leads to ruin. This was a lesson that could be taught to an apprentice smith, a lesson that would keep them from experimenting with forces they could not control. The truth was a burden that would crush the uninitiated. The legend was a tool for survival. She saw how her own role was being written out of the story, and in a strange way, she was grateful. In the tales told by the fireside, the apprentice was often forgotten entirely, or was a mere bystander who fled in terror. There was no Lyra who made the desperate climb to seek a hermit's wisdom, no Lyra who held the cold iron hammer and spoke the words of unbinding. This anonymity was her greatest success. It meant the secret was safe. Her life of quiet vigilance, of watching the mountain passes for any sign of the strange ore, was a duty performed in the shadows, and the evolving myth was the best possible shield for that work. The event had been successfully transformed. It was no longer a recent, raw personal tragedy for a handful of survivors. It had been elevated, distilled into a cultural parable, a foundational myth that now served to define the boundaries of their world. The impact of those few terrible days in the mountains had escalated from a private grief to a public cornerstone, a story that would subtly shape the values and cautions of their civilization for centuries to come. The craftsmen had vanished, but their failure had become immortal. Centuries flowed like molten ore, cooling into the familiar shapes of history. The clans prospered, their wars and alliances becoming the stuff of old songs, and the name Kaelen faded from common speech, preserved only in the most cryptic of verses. The art of the smith, however, endured, passed down from master to apprentice in forges that now hummed with the ordinary, comforting sounds of iron and fire. Yet, woven into the very fabric of this ancient craft, a subtle and inexplicable echo remained. In isolated forges, when a particularly skilled smith worked a vein of rare, deep earth metal, a shimmering ore known as star iron for its speckled, celestial appearance, a strange phenomenon would sometimes occur. As the metal reached its critical temperature, just as it began to yield to the hammer, a fine, silvery mist would weep from its surface. It was not steam, for it was cold to the touch, and it would hang in the air for a moment like a ghost of breath on a winter morning before vanishing without a trace. The old masters, the ones who had learned from masters who had learned from masters, would simply nod grimly, muttering that the metal was remembering. They had no explanation for new apprentices, only a deeply ingrained caution, a rule of thumb passed down without a clear origin. When the metal weeps, you slow your hammer, you quiet your heart, and you work with a reverence bordering on fear. This was not a technical instruction, it was a spiritual one, a fragment of a forgotten protocol for handling a grief that had been baked into the world. These occurrences were rare enough to be dismissed as legend by many, but their persistence across generations pointed to a deeper truth. The phenomenon was an echo, a psychic scar on the substance of reality itself that resonated under specific conditions. Just as a deep wound can ache long after it has healed, signaling a change in the weather, the trauma of the first forging had left a permanent impression on the nature of certain materials. The act of creation, especially one that had brushed so closely against absolute negation, had altered the possibilities of craft forever. It was as if the violent unmaking of the prototype ring had sent a shockwave backwards and forwards through time, imprinted a warning into the DNA of metalwork. This was not the ring's malevolent power reaching out that had been severed. This was the world itself bearing a witness mark, a permanent flaw in the crystal of existence that served as a constant, subtle reminder. The stakes of true creation were not merely about skill or ambition. They were about engaging with fundamental forces that, once disturbed, could leave a permanent mark on the tapestry of being. Alongside this physical echo, a cultural one persisted in the oldest songs, sung by bards in the great halls. The tales of Kalin had been polished by time into the smooth, parabolic shapes of myth. He was now an archetypal figure, a stand-in for all who dared too much. But within these polished tales, there were always a few stubborn, uncut details that refused to be worn away. The songs always spoke of a first ring, a circle of power that was forged but never worn. No bard could describe its purpose or its appearance, only its fate. It was lost, unmade, a promise that was broken before it could be kept. This specific, haunting image of a completed object that never fulfilled its function resonated deeply with the crafting community. For any smith, the moment a tool leaves the anvil is a birth. Its use in the world is its life. A thing made that is never used is a profound sadness, a soul without a body. The first ring of the songs became a symbolic shorthand for the ultimate failure of a craftsperson, to create something so perfect, so potent, that it cannot be integrated into the world, an achievement that becomes its own tombstone. The connection between the weeping metal in the forges and the first ring of the songs was never made explicitly. They existed as separate strands of folklore, one a practical oddity of the trade, the other a poetic metaphor. Yet, for a mind that could hold both ideas, a terrifyingly beautiful picture emerged. It suggested that the consequences of that long-ago catastrophe were not locked in the past. They were alive, vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of everyday perception, manifesting in the cold mist of a worked metal and the melancholy refrain of an old song. The scar on the world was not a dead thing. It was a living memory, and the craft of smithing, the act of shaping the bones of the world, would forever be conducted in its shadow. Every time a master smith felt that familiar chill and saw the silvery haze rise from the anvil, they were unknowingly participating in a ritual of remembrance. They were touching the edge of a wound that had been inflicted on reality, and in that moment, they were reminded that their power to create was inseparable from the responsibility to do no harm. The echo in the craft was the world's way of ensuring that the lesson of the vanished craftsmen, though their names were forgotten, would never truly be lost. The decades did not so much pass for Lyra as they settled upon her shoulders like a fine, constant dust. The vibrant young apprentice with the keen eye and the questioning heart was now a figure of the high places, her hair the color of the winter snow that crowned the peaks, her face a map of wrinkles carved by wind and memory. She had not chosen a hermit's life out of a desire for solitude, but as the only logical conclusion to a story that could not be allowed to end. The clans in the valley below had their comforting myth, their tale of a proud smith and a tragic rockslide, and she had become a ghost in that story, a character wisely edited out. Her home was no longer a forge among people, but a simple stone shelter built into the lee of a cliff, overlooking the vast, silent bowl of land that held the entrance to the earth's heart. This was her vigil, this was her post. From this high vantage point, the world unfolded in a cycle of seasons, each one a reminder of the passage of time and the persistence of life. She saw the green flush of spring creep up the valleys, the deep blues of summer, the fiery brilliance of autumn, and the stark, sleeping white of winter. She lived with the eagles and the mountain goats, learning their languages, her own voice growing rusty from disuse. Yet, amidst this profound natural beauty, her purpose remained as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Her watch was not over the living world, but over the memory of a specific, contained death. She was a sentinel guarding a tomb that no one else knew existed, ensuring that the silence of the forge remained absolute, that no curious hunter or ambitious prospector would ever stumble upon the glassy crater on the anvil and sense the echo of the power that had been unmade there. But her vigilance extended far beyond that one terrible cavern. The hermit's warning echoed in her mind with the clarity of yesterday. The shard of discord was a fragment, and where there was one fragment, there could be others. The ore from which the prototype was forged had fallen from the stars. Who was to say another piece had not landed in some distant desert, or lay buried at the bottom of a forgotten ocean, waiting for a curious hand to dig it up. Her watch was therefore twofold. She guarded the site of the tragedy, yes, but she also watched the world. She tracked the paths of migratory birds, listening for songs that spoke of strange, cold stones in far-off lands. She studied the dreams that came to her in the deep silence of the night, for she had been touched by the ring's psyche, and she believed some faint, sympathetic connection might remain, a thread that could tremble if another piece of the anomalous ore was ever disturbed. Her life became a continuous act of perception, a filtering of the world's noise for one specific, disastrous frequency. This was the final, personal consequence of their failure. Kaelen had paid with his life in a single, explosive moment of sacrifice. Ilian and Brenn had paid with their abrupt erasure from existence, but Lyra's payment was a slow, lifelong expenditure. It was paid in the currency of forgotten birthdays and unshared laughter, in the absence of an apprentice to whom she could pass on her considerable skill, in the simple, human comfort of a hand to hold in the dark. She had exchanged a normal life for the burden of remembrance. She was the sole remaining keeper of the true history, the only living soul who understood that the price of creation could be the unraveling of reality itself. This knowledge was not a power, it was a cage, and the mountains were its bars. Her freedom was the certainty that her imprisonment kept everyone else safe. There were times, in the deep of winter, when the wind howled like the lost voices from the ring, that she questioned the value of her vigil. Had she simply traded one form of obsession for another? Was she, like Kaelen, merely a different kind of fool, chasing a ghost in the machine of the world? But then she would remember the exact sound of the air, distorting as it swallowed Brenn, or the sight of the silvery mist forming the sorrowful face of a being from a dead world, and the doubt would vanish. Her obsession was not for a goal, but against an outcome. Kaelin's had been a positive force, driving toward a finish line. Hers was a negative one, a constant, steady pressure applied to prevent a line from being crossed. It was a quieter, far less glorious form of heroism, one that would never be celebrated in song, because its greatest success was a nothing, an absence, a disaster that never happened. And so, the aged Lyra, the hermit of the mountain, maintained her watch. She became as much a part of the landscape as the rocks themselves, a figure of whispered legend among the few highland shepherds who sometimes glimpsed her from a distance. They called her the Stone Woman, believing she was a spirit who guarded the mountain's secrets. They were not entirely wrong. Her vigil was the final, enduring thread connecting the present to that cataclysmic past. It was a promise made to the ghosts of her friends and to the future of a world that remained blissfully unaware of its own fragility. As long as she drew breath, the cost of the first ring would be remembered, and a pair of eyes that had seen the heart of the abyss would remain open, scanning the horizon, standing guard against the return of the darkness. And so, our story does not conclude with a triumphant cheer or the clear ring of a successful creation, but with a different kind of sound altogether, the soft, persistent whisper of the wind across a high mountain pass. This is the sound of memory, and it is carried by a solitary figure who is no longer the young woman we first met. Lyra's journey has been one of the most profound transformations a soul can undergo. She began as an apprentice, her role defined by learning, by trusting in the wisdom of her master, her primary tool, a question asked in a warm, familiar forge. But through the crucible of unimaginable events, that doubt has been tempered into a steely, unyielding certainty. She is no longer a student, she is a sentinel. Her forge is the entire horizon, her anvil is the silent mountain, and her hammer is the weight of a secret too terrible to be shared. Her life is not one of creation, but of prevention, a quiet, endless vigil against the echo of a mistake that nearly unmade the world. This final state of affairs reveals a subtle but permanent change in the world itself, a shift that goes far deeper than any political treaty or forgotten battle. The true legacy of the prototype ring is not a physical object, but a psychological scar, a lesson etched not in stone, but in the very consciousness of reality. It is the understanding that certain acts of ambition, certain brushes with powers beyond our comprehension, do not simply fade away when the immediate danger passes. They leave a mark, a kind of metaphysical residue. Some things, once brought into being, even if they are almost immediately unmade, can never be entirely erased from existence. Their potential, their shadow, remains. They become a permanent part of the universe's ledger, a dangerous knowledge that now exists where there was once only innocence. The world is wiser, but it is also more fragile, aware of a darkness that sleeps just beneath the surface of things. This is why the story had to transform from a personal tragedy into a collective myth. The raw, horrifying truth was a burden too great for any society to bear in its naked form. It would have been a paralyzing poison. So, human ingenuity, in its need to survive and to warn future generations, performed a necessary act of alchemy. It took the sharp, painful shards of truth, the psychic resonance, the consuming void, the silent unmaking, and softened them into the golden, manageable shape of a parable. The myth of the arrogant smith and his cursed ring is not a lie, it is a container. It is a safe, durable vessel that carries the essential warning without spilling the corrosive truth. It weaves a legacy of caution directly into the fabric of culture, teaching each new generation to approach the forge, and indeed any great ambition, with humility and respect for the unknown. In the end, we are left not with answers, but with responsibilities. Lyra's solitary watch is the ultimate expression of this. Her life is a testament to the fact that containing knowledge can be as important as acquiring it. That protecting the world sometimes means standing alone on a cold mountain, remembering so that others may forget. The circle of the ring was broken, but it has been replaced by another, unbreakable circle, the endless cycle of remembrance and vigilance. The craftsmen vanished, but their story did not. It was distilled into a whisper on the wind, a chill in the forge, a haunting verse in an old song, a permanent, quiet reminder that the greatest creations are not always the things we build, but the catastrophes we successfully guard against, ensuring the world continues, blissfully unaware of the abyss it narrowly